Clara Suarez was born on February 3, 1958, in Bogotá, Colombia. Her father, an electrical engineer, was very ambitious and dreamed of someday moving to the United States. This desire had a huge influence on his daughter. But when the girl was 6 years old, her father passed away, and her mother, who worked as a seamstress, had to shoulder the full burden of caring for the family. Clara was determined and smart, just like her father. From a young age, she was interested in medicine, and after finishing high school, she first enrolled in college and then in dental school in Colombia. After training as a specialist, Clara opened her own dental office. At 32, she fulfilled her father's dream by moving to the USA and settling in Houston. To practice in another country, Clara needed to obtain a college diploma in the States. She enrolled at the University of Texas and, to pay for her education and living expenses, worked part-time in her free time from studies. After graduating from college, Clara got a job at the Castle Dental Center in Houston, Texas. One day, the 33-year-old young woman saw an ad for auditions for the Miss Columbia beauty pageant. Deciding to take a risk, she didn't lose. Winning the contest marked the beginning of her success. At 34, Clara met David Harris, an orthodontist from the Castle Center. They quickly found common ground and started dating. David was divorced and had a daughter, Lindsay, who was about 4 years old at the time. David's ex-wife said she divorced him because he was too focused on his career and simply neglected everything else. But Clara and David were a perfect match for each other because both had huge plans and ambitions in their professional fields. Their relationship developed quickly, and soon David and Clara got married. They held a festive wedding ceremony in 1992 on Valentine's Day at the Hilton Hotel. Now they became the Harrises, successful, determined, ambitious, and opened their own practices. Their colleagues said that Clara and David called each other on the phone at least 3 times a day. They constantly stayed in touch with each other, and every conversation ended with the phrase, "I love you." It was sweet and touching. Clara and David seemed like the ideal couple. In 1993, Clara opened her own dental clinic. David often came to her office to help. Later, Clara helped David open an orthodontic clinic. In the end, over a few years, the spouses created a family dental empire that thrived, and they became quite influential people. In 1998, the couple bought a small mansion in the upscale suburb of Friendswood near Houston. Their home was luxurious, with 6 spacious bedrooms, top-class finishes, a long driveway, and a pool. The backyard overlooked a beautiful creek. In this area, there was even a private airstrip, as many neighbors had their own planes. In the same year, Clara gave birth to twin boys, Brian and Bradley. The Harrises' life was successful and happy. They built an empire and enjoyed every moment spent together. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Clara said that her children were the most valuable thing she had. But the woman considered her silver Mercedes-Benz S430 to be the true symbol of success. For her, it was the embodiment of her dream, confirmation that she had achieved everything she dreamed of. Children, a beloved and loving husband, a home full of abundance. However, even with that, Clara's ambitions didn't end. She and her husband planned to open a mega office that would become a universal center for meeting all the dental needs of the population. While the Harrises built their empire, gossip began to spread in the small district where they lived. The private detective agency, Blue Moon Investigations, was overflowing with cases. People loved to gossip, especially the wealthy. Bobby Botch, the owner of Blue Moon, received many orders from wives suspecting their husbands of cheating. Her agency focused on women and mostly consisted of female employees. Usually, cheated wives turned to them. But there was one rare case when 2 men came to the agency, Chuck Knight and Steve Bridges. They wanted to find out if too close a relationship had developed between their wives, if there was a secret affair between them. The thing was, these 2 couples were best friends. They lived not far from each other, went to church together, and raised their children together. At some point, rumors spread around the neighborhood that the two women's relationship was much closer than just friendly. At first, Chuck and Steve didn't believe the rumors, but then they began to notice that something had indeed changed in their relationships with their spouses. They decided to hire a detective to follow their wives, Julie Knight and Gail Bridges. One evening, both women got together to go to the shopping mall for purchases, while their husbands stayed home to watch the children. The men asked the private detective to follow their spouses and check if they would really shop or go to some hotel instead of the mall to be alone, away from prying eyes. Bobby Botch took on the case and followed Julie and Gail all day. First to the shopping mall, then to McDonald's and a car dealership. After that, the women said goodbye and went to their respective homes. Bobby called the husbands and reassured them that their spouses had just had a shopping day. She didn't notice anything suspicious between them. So the case was closed. Julie and Gail were really just friends. The thing was, Texas had pretty strict rules. If a divorce happened due to the fault of one spouse, they automatically risked losing a large or almost entire share of the jointly acquired property. Apparently, Chuck and Steve just wanted to find a reason for divorce while keeping their money, homes, and everything else. 6 months later, in July 1999, Julie Knight and Gail Bridges, the wives of Chuck and Steve, appeared in Bobby Botch's office. They both wanted to file for divorce because they were being blackmailed with the claim that they had intimate relations between them. Julie thought her husband Chuck was hiding something. The women wanted surveillance set up on their husbands, but Gail backed out at the last minute. So Bobby took on following only Chuck. Of course, the detective didn't mention a word about the fact that Julie and Gail's husbands had previously come to her agency to set up surveillance as well. Bobby followed Chuck around the city, not really expecting results. However, a surprise awaited her. One day, Knight went to meet another woman. It turned out that Chuck was cheating on his wife with a married woman named Lori Wells. Lori was another close friend of Julie and Gail. They often hung out together and went to church. All three couples were in the same group and knew each other well. And in the end, it all resulted in all three couples deciding to separate. By the end of 2001, they had all completed their divorce proceedings. After separating from her husband, 38-year-old Gail Bridges took the children and moved to another district where she had a small house. She got a job as an administrator and secretary at the dental center where David Harris's main office was located. The young woman immediately appealed to David, and soon the center's employees noticed that the boss was clearly not indifferent to his secretary. In February 2002, Gail and David's relationship smoothly turned into a full-fledged affair. When you work in an office, it's easy to notice when something is going on between people. Diana Sherrill worked as a manager in several offices and knew both David and his wife Clara well. She even considered Clara her friend, so she was very angry when she learned that the new secretary had started an affair with the married boss. Moreover, Diana had a good attitude toward David Harris and worried that because of a stupid fling, he could lose his dreams, lose his family, and ruin his career. And all because of this woman. Lindsay, David's daughter from his first marriage, came every summer to live with her father and Clara, whom she considered almost a second mother. One day she came to the office and also saw her father flirting with the secretary, but the girl decided not to tell anyone yet. But office manager Diana Sherrill didn't stay silent and told Clara everything. She pulled her aside and advised her to pay attention to David's behavior to protect her marriage. Clara wasn't stupid. She guessed that her husband had started an affair on the side, but she didn't want to believe it until the end. In an attempt to dispel her doubts, Clara called her mother-in-law, with whom she had a good relationship, and asked the question that tormented her. In the mother's opinion, could David be cheating on her? The mother-in-law assured her that her son never even looked at other women because he truly and genuinely loved his wife. But even the husband's mother's complete confidence in this matter didn't convince Clara, who felt in her gut that her marriage with David was under threat. Returning home, she approached her husband and directly asked what kind of relationship he had with Gail Bridges. David blushed and not very convincingly tried to turn it all into a joke. However, the next morning, the man decided to confess. He told Clara that once he and Gail went to lunch and he kissed her hand. It was like a confession from the husband, though not a full one, because David said that at the moment, he couldn't sort out his feelings. Clara, although it was hard to imagine, remained calm, at least outwardly. She told her husband that despite all the years they had lived together, she wasn't going to put up with infidelity and would file for divorce since he liked another woman. David begged her to stay, promised to do everything possible to avoid separation. He didn't want to lose everything they had built together, but Clara was adamant and wasn't going to back down. David's daughter Lindsay was in the kitchen the whole time and heard almost the entire conversation. When Clara came downstairs, Lindsay couldn't hold back and told her that all the employees in the office knew about David's affair with the secretary and were actively discussing it. Only then did the veil fall from Clara's eyes. She suddenly realized that her husband had been deceiving her all this time. The woman went upstairs and confronted David face to face. A quarrel began, and Clara, unable to stand it, slapped him, demanding that he immediately fire Gail and see a family counselor. David, not holding back, pushed Clara to the floor, but then declared that he was leaving and would never return to her. If it hadn't been for Lindsay, who ran in at the noise, it's unknown how it all could have ended. A few minutes later, the Harris spouses got into the car and drove to work together, trying to maintain the appearance of normal life. In the office, Clara headed straight to the secretary's desk and insisted on a serious conversation. She asked Gail about her relationship with David. The secretary didn't dare tell the whole truth and replied that Mr. Harris didn't interest her at all. The conversation ended with Clara taking Gail's office keys and essentially firing her, leaving her standing in confusion on the street. Later, Clara called David's parents and told them everything that had happened. They decided to arrange a family dinner to discuss the situation as a foursome. During dinner, David finally confessed that he had been intimate with Gail and honestly told his parents everything. The family prayed for the spouses, hoping for the best resolution of the conflict. They had dinner and discussed how David and Clara should move forward, how to achieve forgiveness. And with that, the difficult story seemed to come to an end. However, no one could understand what prompted the man to cheat. Some thought that David started resenting Clara after the twins were born because she paid more attention to the children than to her husband. Clara herself thought that David had a midlife crisis, manifested in increased interest in sports, buying a new car, and a fling with the secretary. The morning after Clara learned about her husband's affair on the side, she began an operation called Get My Husband Back. This gave her energy and determination to become better than Gail. Clara went to a beauty salon and dyed her hair blonde, bought new lingerie, hired a personal trainer, and consulted a plastic surgeon about breast augmentation or liposuction. One evening, Clara and David went out to dinner to discuss the situation in a calm atmosphere. At the table, Clara unexpectedly asked what David liked about Gail. The question seemed like a trap. It appeared she wanted to know the truth, but it would surely anger or upset her. The man, intending to save the family, decided to be completely honest. He detailed to his wife the advantages and disadvantages of his mistress, and then her own. While he spoke, Clara made notes on a paper napkin. Starting with Gail, David said that she was beautiful, smart, and had an ideal figure without extra weight. He noted her large breasts, her faith in him, her ability to handle money, and that in bed she fulfilled his fantasies. And as a disadvantage, he only mentioned her hands and legs, which seemed too masculine to him. When it came to Clara's turn, David said that she was beautiful, smart, and her hands and legs were better than Gail's. With that, the list of advantages seemed exhausted. Moving on to disadvantages, David was much more eloquent. He directly stated that Clara didn't allow him to do everything he wanted, that she constantly interrupted him, that she always planned everything. He called her a bad communicator, a pessimist, and added that she was wasteful with money. Clara calmly noted her minuses, but David got carried away, declaring that he considered his wife too large and that this fullness negatively affected their intimate life. It's unknown how that evening ended, but the next day Clara announced at work her voluntary resignation. She decided to take advantage of the moment and focus on her own transformation, on saving the marriage, and on the family. After that, David told Clara that he wanted to personally talk to Gail and finally break off the relationship. Clara suggested he just call, but David insisted on a personal meeting. His wife agreed. David called Gail, and Clara, of course, listened on speakerphone. They agreed to meet for dinner on Wednesday evening. Clara planned to come with her husband, wait outside, and observe the conversation. However, David wanted her to come inside with him. When David's daughter Lindsay found out about this, she insisted that Clara take her along. The girl was also interested in sitting in the restaurant and watching the former lovers, but David didn't like the idea. He decided that he would go to the meeting alone. In the end, that's what happened. The week passed in anxious thoughts. Clara, immersed in her thoughts, built the wildest assumptions, as sometimes happens. She recalled city rumors that Gail had intimate relationships with women, and it dawned on Clara. What if the secretary was seducing David only for his money, to then live in luxury with her real partner? However, before telling David about this, Clara needed proof. She couldn't just go and declare that in reality, Gail didn't love men, but preferred women. She needed to confirm it personally, and Mrs. Harris turned to the agency called Blue Moon Investigations. Clara called the well-known Bobby Botch and laid out her dramatic story. As a first step, she asked to eavesdrop on the upcoming Wednesday conversation between David and Gail about the breakup, and the Blue Moon employees gladly took on the case. So, Wednesday evening arrived. According to the plan, Mr. Harris was supposed to go straight from work to the restaurant, but Clara wasn't sure of his honest intentions, so she called one of the office employees, her friend, and asked her to follow David. That's how the cheated wife learned that her husband was heading not to the restaurant at all, but to Gail's house. This was a surprise for Clara. The woman flew into a rage and decided to sort out the situation herself. According to Clara, after finishing the conversation, she finished a bottle of wine, got the address of her rival, grabbed the car keys, and set off. David's daughter Lindsay decided to join her. The two of them got into the car and set off on Harris's trail. Lindsay was driving. First, the women went to Gail's house, but David's car wasn't there. Then they went to the restaurant where the meeting was supposed to take place, but the lovers weren't there either. After that, Clara and Lindsay stopped at another restaurant, but again found no one. Clara was getting more irritated and nervous, not knowing where her husband and his mistress were. In the end, she called the Blue Moon Investigations Department and clarified the location of her unfaithful spouse. But the operator replied that they feared an inadequate reaction from her, so they couldn't provide detailed information. Clara didn't accept the refusal and asked for the mobile phone number of the private detective handling the case. After some hesitation, the operator gave her the number. Using persuasion, pleas, and threats, the woman finally found out that David and Gail had gone to a hotel. Which one exactly, the detective didn't say, fearing impulsive actions from the client. However, over the years of living together, Clara had managed to study her husband. She guessed that he might have gone with his mistress to the Hilton Hotel, where David and Clara had celebrated their wedding. Her suspicions were strengthened when they saw Gail's SUV in the hotel parking lot. Clara jumped out of the car and paced nervously around for a while. Then, together with Lindsay, she headed to the hotel lobby. Approaching the reception desk, the women asked in which room David Harris and Gail Bridges were staying. The porter replied that they had no such guests. Later, it became known that David paid in cash and asked not to mention his name. That's when Lindsay came up with a plan to lure David out of the hotel. She texted him that one of the twins was seriously ill and the father needed to return home urgently. For credibility, the girl also called him on his mobile and heard that David was already hurrying home. Clara and Lindsay stayed waiting in the lobby. The man didn't appear for a long time, and they were already starting to worry if they had made a mistake. But then there was the sound of elevator doors opening. David and Gail came out of the cabin holding hands. When Clara saw this, she lost her self-control. She started shouting that David was her husband. Then she rushed at Gail and grabbed the homewrecker by the hair, intending to hit her as hard as possible. While Clara was yanking her rival, Lindsay found herself in the center of events. The girl grabbed her purse and started hitting David, her father, with it, saying, "I hate you." Meanwhile, the public watched the fight with interest. But the hotel staff finally couldn't stand it and intervened, trying to separate Clara and Gail. David grabbed his wife by the head and pressed her to the floor. At that time, the porter quickly led Gail through the back entrance to the parking lot. When it was all over, Clara and Lindsay also left the hotel, but the cheated wife wasn't going to let the situation go. Clara got behind the wheel and Lindsay in the passenger seat. In the distance, they saw David helping Gail get into her car. At that moment, something snapped in Clara's head. The only thing she wanted was to separate her husband from his mistress. She sharply pressed the gas pedal and raced through the parking lot. David, noticing his wife's car, tried to stop her from an ill-considered step and warningly placed his hands on the Mercedes hood. To Clara, overcome with anger and burning jealousy, this acted like a red rag to a bull. She pressed the gas and literally knocked David down. He flew about 7 meters and screamed in pain. Daughter Lindsay became a witness to the horror unfolding and tried to get out of the car. But Clara pressed the gas again, sharply turned around, and directed the car at David again. Then, making another U-turn, Clara hit him a third time and only then stopped. The shocked Lindsay couldn't take it anymore. She swung and slapped Clara, then jumped out of the car, fell to the ground in hysterics, and screamed. According to Clara, Lindsay's slap brought her to her senses. She herself was in shock from what she had just done. The woman jumped out of the car and ran to David. Eyewitnesses staying at the hotel heard screams, crying, someone's howls in the parking lot, and rushed to help. Running outside, they saw a man lying on the ground and a woman holding him in her arms. It was Clara. She was furiously shaking David and through tears said, "David, look what you made me do." A witness tried to pull Clara away and warned that the victim couldn't be shaken. David's injuries were serious. One side of his head was scraped and teeth were knocked out. Soon, police and an ambulance arrived at the scene. David was taken to the hospital, where he was soon pronounced dead, and Clara was arrested. But where was the private detective all this time, and why didn't he prevent the crime? Assuming that surveillance of David that evening might drag on, the investigator invited a friend along. They parked in the hotel lot and prepared to wait. David and Gail entered the hotel, but the private detective got chatting with her friend and didn't notice Clara and Lindsay appearing in the parking lot. When they heard the screech of tires and saw Clara's Mercedes, the private detective started filming the incident on video. The filming was done at night and from a great distance, so the footage came out blurry. Nevertheless, it clearly shows how Mrs. Harris's car ran over the standing man. Clara was charged with intentional homicide. She herself argued that it all happened accidentally. She ran over David only once, although numerous witnesses claimed it happened 3 times. And the video recording from the scene confirmed this. The lawyer insisted that Clara had lost her mind from rage and wasn't controlling her actions. At the same time, she did everything to save the marriage. She quit her job, changed her image, and was going to family counseling with David. The trial began in January 2003 and lasted about 3 weeks. The public was divided into 2 camps. Some believed that Mrs. Harris had committed a premeditated crime. Others blamed the deceased David, who had driven his wife to such a state. Surprisingly, David's parents supported Clara. They considered her innocent and continued to love her as a daughter-in-law. David's daughter, Lindsay, on the contrary, turned away from Clara, although she had always treated her like a second mother before. The entire process was very emotional. David's family and several female employees from the dental clinics testified in support of Clara. Everyone loved her and spoke about how sweet, honest, and kind-hearted she was. How her relationship with David was like a marriage made in heaven. But no one expected that Clara would also be supported by her husband's mistress, Gail Bridges. She said that David immediately convinced her that he, and when the floor was given to the defendant, her account of what happened touched the hearts of the public. Most people noted that David had put Clara through hell in the days preceding his death. It was obvious that Clara still loved her husband and did everything possible to bring back the old feelings. But in the end, he still chose another woman. Ultimately, the jury found that the crime was committed in a state of passion. The court, taking into account the circumstances of the case, sentenced Clara Harris to the maximum punishment, 20 years in prison and a fine of $10,000. After the verdict, David's parents, who had been promised custody of the twins, suddenly stopped answering Clara's calls and refused to bring the boys to visit her in prison. Therefore, when the temporary custody agreement expired, Clara did everything to have the twins given to a married couple with whom the Harrises were very close. Their names were even listed in Clara and David's will. For example, if something happened to them, the couple promised to take the children under their care. In the end, that's what happened. In 2018, 60-year-old Clara, having spent 15 years behind bars, was released early, and in 2023, her probation ended, and she became a completely free woman. Due to her conviction, she lost her dentist's license. However, in prison, Clara translated texts into Braille for adaptive textbooks, which is what she continued doing after her release, getting a full-time editor position. Clara was released from prison early on the condition that she wouldn't contact Lindsay, David's older daughter. According to Mrs. Harris, that's how it turned out. Lindsay no longer appeared in public places and lived her own life, trying to forget the sad picture of her father's death. The twin boys, who were 4 years old when the crime occurred, have grown up. Now they are about 27 years old. They forgave their mother and now spend a lot of time with her. David's parents passed away in 2017 before Clara's release from prison. Gail Bridges tried not to attract attention after the trial. The woman suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. To improve her health, she underwent a course of therapy. And yet, jealousy and anger are very dangerous. And when a person is in that state, it's hard to predict their actions. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. They say family is a safe harbor, a place where you are loved not for your achievements, but simply because you exist. We are used to believing that blood ties are the strongest fabric in the universe. But what if that fabric is nothing more than a thin theatrical prop? What if the person smiling at you across a celebratory dinner table has already scouted the location for your grave? December 2003, Sugar Land, Texas. The name of the city itself suggests sweetness, and the lives of the Whitaker family perfectly matched that image. Success, wealth, 2 wonderful sons, and a luxurious home in a gated community where even the shadows seem neatly trimmed. That evening, they were celebrating. They were celebrating what every parent guides their child toward for years, their eldest son, Bart, graduating from college. Laughter at Papacito's cantina, the clinking of glasses, the pride in the eyes of a father and mother. They don't know yet that this dinner is their last. They don't know that the diploma Bart is talking about so passionately doesn't even exist. They don't know that for several years, their son has been leading a double life, turning reality into a massive psychological thriller. And while Kent and Tricia Whitaker were paying the check, looking forward to a cozy evening at home, something was already lurking in the darkness of their foyer, something hired by their own child. Today, we will try to understand, how did a golden boy turn into the cold-blooded director of his own family's massacre? And why did a father, who lost everything that night, decide that his only remaining mission was to save his executioner from the death penalty? This is the story of Thomas Bart Whitaker, a story of a fake graduation, real blood, and a forgiveness that borders on madness. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Sugarland isn't just a suburb of Houston. It is the embodiment of the American dream, cast in concrete and decorated with perfect lawns. Here, doors aren't locked, and the crime rate is so low that the biggest event of the week might be an improperly parked golf cart. This is where the Whitaker family lived, in the prestigious Lake Point neighborhood. The head of the family, Kent Whitaker, was the picture of stability. A successful accountant and a deeply religious man, he built his life on the principles of honesty and hard work. His wife, Tricia, was the heart of the home, a loving, gentle woman who adored her sons. They had everything: a substantial bank account, the respect of their peers, and two sons who seemingly inherited their parents' best traits. The younger, Kevin, was the life of the party. The eldest, Bart, was the pride of the family. Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, born in 1972, was accustomed to the best from childhood. His parents didn't just love him, they invested in him. Private schools, top-tier camps, expensive gifts. Bart grew up to be a charismatic, intelligent, and incredibly persuasive young man. Those around him saw a future leader, a man for whom every door was open. But somewhere deep inside, beneath that flawless shell, a crack began to grow. Bart had a strange trait. He could not stand failure. Not in the sense that he strove for perfection, but in the sense that he could not admit when something went wrong. For him, it was easier to build a labyrinth of lies than to say to his father, "Dad, I made a mistake." After high school, Bart enrolled at Baylor University, but soon transferred to Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, ironically, the city that houses the most famous prison in Texas. His parents dutifully paid the tuition bills, providing money for books, housing, and living expenses. Bart regularly came home talking about his academic successes, difficult exams, and demanding professors. Kent Whitaker, used to trusting people, never even thought to check his son's transcripts. Why would he? Bart was a mature, responsible man. But the truth was that Bart Whitaker had stopped being a student during his very first semester. He had been expelled for academic failure almost immediately. However, Bart didn't pack his bags and return home with a confession. He did something much more complex. Every day for several years, he pretended to go to class. He bought textbooks and read them so he could hold conversations about subjects he never attended. He forged letters from the university and grade reports. Imagine the level of psychological tension. Year after year, month after month, you wake up in Huntsville, knowing that your life is a house of cards. Bart lived about 70 miles away from his parents, and that distance allowed him to maintain the illusion. He spent his parents' money on expensive clothes, watches, and outings with friends, while Kent and Tricia were certain their son was grinding the granite of science. Bart wasn't just a liar. He was the architect of an alternative reality. His friends at the university also believed he was a student. He stepped into the role so deeply that it seemed he began to believe his own legend. But every lie has an expiration date, and that date was called graduation. By 2003, Bart realized he had reached a dead end. His parents were expecting a commencement ceremony in December. They planned to invite relatives and book a table at a top restaurant. Bart had no diploma. He didn't even have student status. If the truth came out, his perfect world would collapse. He would lose his financial support, and more importantly, he would lose the admiration he saw in his father's eyes. For most people, the way out would be a confession, a difficult conversation, tears, perhaps a period of estrangement. But life goes on. However, in the mind of Bart Whitaker, a different plan took shape. If there is no family, there is no need for excuses. He began thinking about murdering his loved ones long before that fateful December. It wasn't a spontaneous burst of rage. It was a cold, mathematical calculation. Bart began looking for those who would help him solve the problem. He sought executors among his acquaintances, carefully feeling out the ground, talking about an inheritance that would total more than $1 million. He didn't just want to hide his lie. He wanted to be rewarded for keeping it. The atmosphere in the Whitaker home in early December 2003 was upbeat. Tricia was buying a new dress for the celebration. Kevin was preparing a gift for his older brother. Kent proudly told colleagues that Bart was finally entering the professional world. Meanwhile, Bart was finalizing details with Chris Brazelton and Stephen Champagne, the men he chose as his accomplices. Bart detailed the timing, who stands where, who opens fire, how the botched robbery scene should look. He even arranged to be wounded himself to deflect suspicion. December 10th. There was a typical Texas chill in the air. The family gathered to head to the restaurant. Bart was smiling. He was cheerful and outgoing. He had just finished his last exam. In reality, all he had handed over that day were the keys to his parents' home, given to a man with a gun in his hand. In any tragedy like this, there is always a period that investigators later call the calm before the storm. For the Whitaker family, this calm stretched on for years. Looking at them from the outside, you would see the embodiment of harmony. Kent and Tricia didn't just love their children, they were enchanted by them. Bart, as the eldest, always set the bar. He was that gold standard by which success was measured in their social circle. But if we look closer at the relationships within this home, we see something strange. It was a love built on absolute trust that bordered on blindness. Kent Whitaker believed that honesty was the foundation of their family. He couldn't have imagined that beneath this foundation, Bart had long ago dug a deep, rotten pit. Their relationship resembled a complex dance. The parents gave Bart everything: freedom, finances, support. In return, Bart gave them a flawless image. He was polite, religious, and always ready to help. But behind this mask hid a man who felt not gratitude toward his loved ones, but a growing, hollow irritation. He was burdened by the need to constantly meet their expectations. Their kindness infuriated him because it made him feel obligated. The first truly alarming bells rang back in 2001, 2 years before the finale. Bart had already begun weaving his deadly web back then. He tried to hire an acquaintance to kill his family. The plan fell through only because the potential executor got scared and informed the police. You might ask, how could they continue living as if nothing happened after such a thing? Here lies the main mystery of the Whitaker family. When the police came to Kent and told him that his son might be plotting something horrific, the father simply didn't believe it. He talked to Bart, and Bart, this great master of manipulation, convinced his father with tears in his eyes that it was just a misunderstanding. He claimed he was depressed, that he was just talking nonsense from stress. Kent, wanting to save his child, chose to believe a lie instead of the frightening truth. He didn't just forgive his son, he erased the incident from his memory as if it had never happened. From that moment on, Bart realized he was invincible. If he could convince them of his innocence after a direct tip-off, it meant he could do anything. The lie about the university became his full-time job. Every morning, Bart woke up in his apartment, paid for by his father, put on a clean shirt, and pretended to leave for lectures. In reality, he could sit for hours in coffee shops or shopping malls, simply watching people. He spent thousands of dollars on top-tier designer clothes and expensive watches, convincing his parents these were awards for academic excellence, or the result of his successful investments in the stock market. While his brother Kevin was actually working hard and making plans for the future, Bart lived in a vacuum. He surrounded himself with people he could manipulate. Chris Brazelton and Stephen Champagne were not his friends in the traditional sense. They were his tools. He processed them for months, convincing them that his parents were tyrants who were breaking his life. He promised them a share of an inheritance estimated at several $1,000,000. Bart sold them the death of his loved ones as a business project. Kent Whitaker later recalled that Bart sometimes seemed distant. No, he brushed it off as the hardships of studying and preparing for graduation. Tricia, for her part, tried to surround her eldest son with even more care. She wrote him touching notes and put together gift baskets. She loved a person who did not exist. The fall of 2003 became the time for final assembly. Bart knew that the commencement ceremony was scheduled for December. He had no way out. University officials had long ago removed his name from all lists, but Kent and Tricia continued to plan the celebration. They had already bought a gift for their son, a luxury Rolex watch that Kent planned to place on his wrist after the formal procession. The tension inside Bart reached its peak. He could not allow the shame. In his distorted perception of reality, murder was a more acceptable option than admitting he was a failure. He began conducting rehearsals with his accomplices. They came to the house in Sugarland at night, studied the layout of the rooms, and planned escape routes. Bart even pointed out the spot in his old room where his father's .40 caliber pistol was kept. It was from this weapon that he decided to kill those who gave him life. This wasn't hatred in its purest form. It was cold egocentrism. Bart wanted to maintain his golden boy status at any cost. And if that required his mother to choke on her own blood on the floor of their cozy living room, well, that was a price he was willing to pay. Others would pay it, not him. While Kent Whitaker proudly booked a table at the restaurant for December 10th, Bart Whitaker was checking if there were enough rounds in the Pistols magazine. He continued to smile at dinner, discussing career plans after graduation, while a countdown timer was already ticking in his head. There were only a few days left in the lives of the Whitaker family. December 10th, 2003. A typical Texas Wednesday that should have been a triumph, but instead, it turned into a funeral march. Throughout that day, Bart Whitaker remained in a state of strange, almost frighteningly calm. He already knew the gears were in motion, and there was no turning back. That evening, the Whitaker family gathered in full. They looked like a living advertisement for American prosperity, a successful father, a radiant mother, and 2 grown sons. For Kent and Tricia, the night was overflowing with pride. Their firstborn had graduated from the university. They headed to Papacito's Cantina in Stafford, just a few miles from their home. Inside the restaurant, it was noisy, filled with the scent of spices and tequila. Bart was the life of the party. He ordered the food, cracked jokes, and accepted congratulations. Kent would later recall that his son looked absolutely happy. At one point, Kent handed Bart a box. Inside was a Rolex watch, a symbol of his transition into a successful adult life. Bart slipped it onto his wrist, thanked his father, and kept on laughing. In his pocket, however, his cell phone was vibrating with short messages from Chris Brazier. The killer was already in position. Around 8 p.m., the family left the restaurant. The drive to their home in the prestigious Sugarland neighborhood took only about 10 to 15 minutes. As their SUV pulled into the driveway, Bart intentionally lingered by the vehicle. He claimed he had forgotten his keys or something of the sort, a classic maneuver to ensure he wouldn't be the first to enter the house. 19-year-old Kevin was the first to cross the threshold. Tricia followed closely behind him. Kent brought up the rear. The moment Kevin stepped into the dark foyer, a masked figure stepped out of the shadows. Chris Brazier did not hesitate. The first shot rang out. A .40 caliber bullet struck Kevin directly in the chest. The young man collapsed to the floor, never even having a chance to understand what was happening. Tricia let out a scream, but the next shot silenced her forever. She fell right next to her son. Kent, hearing the thunderous noise, which he would later describe as the sound of 1,000 light bulbs exploding, struggled to grasp reality. He saw a flash and felt a sharp impact in his chest. The bullet passed clean through, piercing his lung. Kent stumbled and fell on the porch of his home, bleeding out under the glow of the street lamp. Finally, Bart ran into the house. This was part of his script, the staging of a struggle. He grappled with Braz here, and the gunman shot him in the arm, just as they had agreed. Bart fell, playing the part of the victim, while the executor fled through the back door and vanished into the night, taking the only loot with him, the murder weapon itself. When the police arrived, they found a horrific scene. Kevin was dead. Tricia was still breathing, but her life was fading with every passing second. Kent lay on the grass, fighting for a single breath of air. And amidst this nightmare stood Bart, the lone witness, miraculously surviving this bloodbath. The scene was chaotic. Paramedics fought to save Tricia, preparing her for an emergency life flight to Memorial Hermann Hospital. Kent and Bart were rushed away in separate ambulances. All of Sugarland stood still. News of a quadruple shooting in one of the city's most elite enclaves spread like wildfire. It seemed impossible. People stepped out onto their perfectly manicured lawns, whispering in fear. Had true evil finally pierced their Sugarland? As police cordoned off the house, the search began. But that night, they were hunting a phantom. From their hospital beds, Bart and Kent gave their initial statements, describing a tall man in black clothing and a ski mask. Bart added a key detail designed to mislead investigators. He, confidently, stated that the attacker was a black man. Officers with K-9 units scoured the area, and helicopters with thermal imaging circled the woods and lake shores, but the killer seemed to have vanished into the Texas night. At the hospital, Kent Whitaker regained consciousness after surgery. The bullet had passed just 2 inches from his heart, lodging in his shoulder. His first thought was his family. But the news was soul-crushing. Kevin had died at the scene. Tricia passed away at the hospital without ever waking up. Of the entire family, only he and Bart remained. In those early days, the city's panic turned into deep mourning. More than 1,000 people gathered for Tricia and Kevin's funeral. It was a sea of tears and unspoken rage. Friends and relatives embraced Kent and Bart as they stood before 2 caskets. Bart looked devastated. He wore a bandage over his gunshot wound, accepted condolences, and wept alongside everyone else. He was the perfect survivor, the grieving son who lost a mother and a brother in a random robbery. But while the city prayed for the departed, lead detective Marshall Slott was already noticing strange, almost invisible threads in the case. The hunt for an outside enemy was yielding nothing, and the police found themselves returning to the house more and more. They were looking for a robber, but they started finding lies. A lot of lies. First, there were no signs of forced entry. The perpetrator had walked into the home as if they had a key. Second, and most baffling, was the fact that almost nothing of value had been taken. The only item missing was the specific .40 caliber pistol, the very weapon used to execute the family. Professional burglars do not leave behind a safe full of jewelry just to steal a single handgun. It looked less like a botched robbery and more like a calculated assassination. Slott decided to look into the very core of the evening's celebration, Bart's graduation. He contacted the university to confirm the young man's credentials. It was the moment the entire house of cards began to sway. "Bart Whitaker?" The administrator's voice was flat. "Detective, he isn't a student here. He was dismissed for academic failure years ago. There was no degree to be handed out this December." The graduation dinner at Papacito's Cantina had been a total fabrication. If his parents were on the verge of discovering his secret life, Bart had the oldest motive in the book, hiding his shame by any means necessary. Investigators began to dig and unearthed a pattern of behavior. They found a history of Bart trying to hire someone to solve his problems as early as 2001, a dark secret the family had tried to bury. But Bart was no amateur. He played the part of the grieving survivor to the hilt, even as he began spending insurance money on new luxuries. The breakthrough finally came through digital footprints. Authorities recovered deleted messages and phone records that the perpetrators thought were gone forever. These records led straight to his inner circle. When faced with the cold reality of a capital murder charge, his accomplices began to break. They detailed the months of planning. They described how the shooter was given access to the house through a window and provided with the family's own weapon. They even explained the orchestrated struggle where Bart was shot in the arm to look like a victim. By the time warrants were issued in June 2004, Bart was gone. He had fled across the border, settling in the town of Cerralvo, Mexico, under the name Rudy Rios. For 15 months, he lived a new life, charming the locals and even finding a girlfriend, convinced the blood on his hands had washed away. But Slot never stopped hunting. He worked with Mexican authorities, and eventually the Golden Boy was cornered. As he was led back toward the Texas border, Bart remained eerily calm, unaware that his own father was already preparing for a different kind of battle. Prosecutors began the process with a detailed reconstruction of the events. They presented the jury not just with dry facts, but with a vivid picture of betrayal. Stephen Champagne, the driver who had taken a plea deal, became the star witness for the prosecution. He received 15 years in prison, but his testimony became Bart's death warrant. Stephen described how Bart stood on the threshold of the house, how he cold-bloodedly pointed out exactly where the bodies of his mother and brother should lie. Chris Brashear, the direct executioner, received a life sentence. But all eyes were on the director. The prosecution proved that Bart didn't just want to hide the lie about his university status. He wanted an inheritance worth roughly $1.5 million, which would have allowed him to continue a life of luxury without ever working a day. To him, his family was merely an obstacle between him and a bank account. However, the most shocking moment of the trial wasn't the evidence. It was the words of Kent Whitaker. Imagine a man who lost his beloved wife and his youngest son. A man who was nearly killed by his own firstborn. Kent stepped up to the podium and, looking the jurors in the eye, spoke words that made the room fall silent. He didn't demand revenge. He asked to spare the life of his executioner. "I am not justifying what he did," Kent said, struggling to contain his emotions. "But Bart is all I have left of my family. If you execute him, you are simply finishing what that killer in the mask started. You will be killing the last part of my life." It was an unheard-of situation for Texas, a state known for its eye-for-an-eye approach to capital murder. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. Despite the father's pleas, the weight of the crime was too heavy. Bart Whitaker was found guilty of capital murder for remuneration. The sentence, death by lethal injection. As the judge read the verdict, Bart didn't flinch. He merely gave a slight nod, as if it were just another role he had to play. He was transported to the Polunsky unit, the highest security prison in Texas, to await his meeting with the executioner. But the story of Bart Whitaker didn't end there. While he counted his days on death row, his father began his own battle. A battle against the entire legal machinery of Texas that would last for 11 long years. Kent visited Bart every single week. There was always a thick sheet of bulletproof glass between them, but the father said that through that glass, he saw a man who had truly repented. While in prison, Bart earned 2 college degrees, helped other inmates, and wrote letters to his father filled with remorse. But the law of the state remained relentless. The execution date was set for February 22, 2018. On that day, Bart ate his last meal. He had already been moved to the death watch cell, just a few hundred feet from the execution chamber. Kent Whitaker stood outside, surrounded by reporters, making one final plea for mercy. And then, something unprecedented happened. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which has only recommended clemency a handful of times in decades, voted unanimously, 7-0, to recommend commuting the sentence to life in prison. It was a shock to the system, but the final word belonged to Governor Greg Abbott. Just 40 minutes before the lethal chemicals were to be injected into Bart's veins, the phone in the death chamber rang. Governor Abbott signed the clemency proclamation. Bart Whitaker became the first person in Texas history to have his execution stayed solely at the request of the victim of the crime. Many in Texas considered the decision an injustice. Critics argued that Bart was a master manipulator who had managed to deceive both his father and the justice system one last time. They pointed to Tricia and Kevin, whose voices were silenced forever on that December night. An eye for an eye. That ancient formula still echoes in our collective consciousness. But Kent Whitaker chose a different path. Today, Bart Whitaker is serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. He will never walk free, never again see the sugar land he once called home. Is this the triumph of love or the ultimate victory of a gifted liar? There is no simple answer. Kent Whitaker says his forgiveness wasn't a gift to his son, but a gift to himself, a way to avoid being consumed by the flames of hatred. In this story, there is no happy ending. There is only the silence of prison corridors and a father who still travels 70 miles every week just to look into the eyes of the man who took everything from him and whom he chose to keep alive anyway. In the end, the most terrifying ghosts are the ones we refuse to let go. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. They say blood is thicker than water, a bond that is supposed to be our ultimate sanctuary, the one thing in this world that never breaks. We are taught from birth that family is everything, the beginning and the end, the people who would do anything to protect us. But what happens when that protective instinct curdles? What happens when protecting our own becomes a justification for the unthinkable? When a family's love transforms into a cold, calculated obsession that demands the total erasure of another bloodline? In the quiet, rolling hills of southern Ohio, where the Appalachian foothills begin to rise, the night of April 21, 2016, felt like any other. The air was cool, the stars were sharp, and the deep silence of rural Pike County was broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. But in 4 separate homes nestled along the winding gravel of Union Hill Road, that silence was about to be shattered by a methodical, clinical execution. 8 people, 3 children left alive in the arms of their dead mothers. No money stolen, no jewelry taken, only a message written in lead. For 2 long years, a whole state would hold its breath, wondering who could be capable of such a monstrous feat. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was a family mission. This is the story of the Pike County Massacre, the most complex, expensive, and haunting investigation in Ohio's history. A story of how a dispute over a single child led a family of 4 to become a mobile death squad, proving that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the very ones who will lead you to your final rest. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Pike County, Ohio is a place where time seems to move a little slower. It's a landscape of vast forests, sprawling farms, and tight-knit communities where your surname carries the weight of generations. Life here isn't always easy. The economy has its struggles, and many families get by through scrapping, doing whatever hard physical work is available to keep the lights on. It's a place where everyone knows everyone. And yet, there are hollows and back roads where a person can disappear into the shadows if they truly want to. At the heart of this community was the Roden family. Christopher Roden Sr., 40 years old, was the patriarch. To those who knew him, Chris was a man of constant motion. He was a man's man, hard-working, skilled with his hands, and deeply devoted to his children. He lived in a trailer on Union Hill Road, often working on cars or demolition projects. His ex-wife, 37-year-old Dana Roden, was the family's emotional anchor. Despite their divorce, Dana and Chris remained close, co-parenting their 3 children with a level of harmony that many envied. Dana was a nursing assistant at a local care center, known for her tireless work ethic and her wide, infectious smile. She was the kind of woman who would work double shifts just to make sure her kids had everything they needed. Their children, 20-year-old Frankie, 19-year-old Hannah, and 16-year-old Chris Jr., were her world. Frankie was a young father himself, living nearby with his 20-year-old fiancée, Hannah Gilly. They had a 6-month-old son and were building a life together in the same rural enclave. Hannah Roden, the middle child, was 19 and possessed the same fiery, independent spirit as her mother. She was beautiful, sharp-tongued when she needed to be, and fiercely protective of her infant daughter, Sophia. To the outside world, the Rodens were a typical, large, extended family. They had their secrets, like the small-scale marijuana grow operations Christopher Sr. managed to supplement their income, but in Pike County, that wasn't uncommon. They were loved, respected, and above all, they were many. A few miles away, another family lived a very different kind of life. The Wagners, Billy, his wife Angela, and their 2 sons, George IV and Jake, were a contrast to the Rodens' open, talkative nature. The Wagners were insular. They were a closed circle. They didn't just live together. They functioned as a single, multi-headed organism. Billy was a man who preferred the company of his dogs and his equipment to people. Angela, the matriarch, was the undisputed commander of the household. She was a woman who demanded total loyalty, managing the family's finances, their schedules, and, most importantly, their secrets. Her sons, George and Jake, were raised in this environment of absolute control. They were homeschooled, kept away from the corrupting influences of the outside world. Jake, the younger son, was particularly close to his mother. He was quiet, perhaps a bit sullen, but he possessed a single-minded intensity that would eventually become the family's undoing. The 2 families were destined to cross paths through the most common of ways, a teenage romance. When Jake Wagner was 17 and Hannah Roden was only 15, they began dating. It was the kind of intense, all-consuming love that only happens when you're young. For a while, the families merged. Hannah spent time at the Wagner farm. Jake was a frequent guest at the Roden trailers. In late 2013, Hannah became pregnant. When Sophia was born, it seemed like the bond between the families was sealed in blood. But behind the scenes, the friction was already beginning to smoke. The Wagners didn't just want to be grandparents. They wanted control. Angela Wagner, accustomed to being the only voice of authority in her sons' lives, found herself at odds with the independent-minded Hannah Roden. Hannah wasn't a Wagner. She wouldn't be told how to raise her daughter, what to wear, or how to think. When the relationship between Jake and Hannah eventually soured and broke in early 2015, the closed circle of the Wagner family didn't just tighten, it turned into a trap. They began to view Hannah not as the mother of their grandchild, but as a threat to their legacy. In the Wagner household, a terrifying philosophy began to take root. If you can't control them, you eliminate them. For the Wagners, little Sophia was a prize that had to be won at any cost. And as the custody dispute began to simmer, the Wagners stopped seeing the Rodens as neighbors or friends. They saw them as an obstacle. They began to watch. They began to plan. They began to calculate how many lives it would take to ensure that Sophia Wagner would never have to spend another day in a Roden home. The hills of Pike County were quiet, but in the Wagner farmhouse, the air was thick with a darkness that no one saw coming. Jake was different from the other boys. He was focused. He didn't party much. He didn't run wild. He was a Wagner, after all. He seemed to offer Hannah a kind of stability, a promise of a future that felt safe. And for Hannah, who grew up in the whirlwind of the large, loud, and sometimes chaotic Roden clan, that stability was magnetic. By the fall, the relationship had accelerated. Hannah became pregnant, and on November 28, 2013, she gave birth to their daughter, Sophia. At first, the birth seemed to draw the two families even closer. The Rodens welcomed Jake into their trailers. The Wagners opened the doors of their farmhouse to Hannah. But it was here, in the transition from a teenage romance to the reality of a shared life, that the first cold shadows began to stretch over the couple. Hannah and the baby moved into the Wagner home. It was a massive, working farm, a place of hard labor and strict routine. To the Rodens, who lived with a live and let live philosophy, the Wagner household was a revelation. It was a kingdom, and Angela Wagner was its queen. In the beginning, Hannah tried. She really did. She wanted to be the perfect mother, the perfect partner. But the honeymoon period didn't just end. It was methodically dismantled. The Wagners didn't just want Hannah to live with them. They wanted to reconstruct her. Angela Wagner began to implement what the family called the rules. They weren't suggestions. They were mandates. Hannah was told how to dress, modestly, strictly. She was told how to speak. She was told how to care for her own daughter. Angela would take Sophia for hours, dismissing Hannah's choices on feeding, sleeping, and even the clothes the baby wore. Jake, instead of standing by his girlfriend, became his mother's enforcer. The quiet boy Hannah fell for was replaced by a man who was constantly hovering, constantly monitoring. He was like a shadow that never left her side. If she wanted to visit her mother, Dana, Jake had to be there. If she wanted to call her brothers, the conversation was often overheard. One of the most chilling red flags emerged during this time. Jake began to obsess over safety, but it felt more like surveillance. He wanted to know where Hannah was every second of every day. He didn't want her having a life outside of the Wagner fence line. To the Rodens, who saw family as a support system, the Wagners saw family as a fortress, and Hannah was increasingly treated like a prisoner rather than a resident. The tension eventually reached a breaking point. Hannah Roden was a Roden through and through. She had a spine of Appalachian steel. She couldn't be broken. She refused to dye her hair the color Angela demanded. She refused to stop seeing her own family, and most importantly, she refused to let the Wagners own her daughter. In early 2015, the perfect union finally shattered. Hannah took Sophia and moved back into her mother's trailer. She thought she was escaping, but for the Wagners, this was a declaration of war. Jake's behavior shifted from possessive to predatory. He began a relentless campaign to get Sophia back. He would show up at the Roden trailers, demanding his daughter. He began documenting every fault he found in the Roden household. The presence of pets, the supposed lack of cleanliness, anything he could use in a court of law. But it wasn't just about the law. Inside the Wagner home, the air was turning toxic. Angela and Billy Wagner didn't see a young mother trying to raise her child. They saw a corrupting influence who was stealing their bloodline. They began to monitor Hannah's social media, tracking her every move. When Hannah started dating again, first a young man named Corey Holdren, the Wagners' fury reached a fever pitch. To them, the idea of another man being around their Sophia was an unforgivable sin. Hannah, sensing the danger, wrote a message to a friend, that would later become a haunting piece of evidence. She said, "I'll never sign papers. They'll have to kill me first." It was a phrase she likely used as a figure of speech, a testament to her resolve. She had no way of knowing that for the people she once called family, those words weren't a warning. They were a roadmap. The Wagners began to realize that as long as the Rodens were alive, they would never have total control over Sophia. And in their world, total control was the only option. The honeymoon was over, and the planning had begun. Down the road, Frankie Roden and his fiancée Hannah Gilly were tending to their young family. Their 6-month-old son, Ruger, was teething, and their 3-year-old was full of that restless energy that only toddlers possess. And then there was Hannah May. At just 19, she was a mother for the second time. Her newborn daughter, Kylie, was only 4 days old, a tiny, fragile life that Hannah cradled with a fierce, protective love. For the Rodens, the day was filled with the mundane tasks of survival. They had no idea they were living through their final hours of peace. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the Union Hill Road, another family was beginning a very different kind of routine. At the Wagner farmhouse, the atmosphere was clinical. There was no nervous energy, only the cold focus of a mission. For months, Billy, Angela, George, and Jake had been preparing for this night. They had purchased a specific truck, modified with a hidden compartment under the floor to stow their weapons. They had bought brass catchers to attach to their pistols, so no shell casings would be left behind. They had even purchased specific shoes from Walmart, shoes they intended to burn as soon as the work was done. In the week leading up to this night, the two brothers, George and Jake, had dyed their hair a dark, muddy brown to better blend into the shadows. They checked their gear one last time: the masks, the ammunition, and a sophisticated device to jam cell phone signals, ensuring that even if someone woke up, they would find themselves in a digital void, unable to call for help. Around 11 p.m., the mission began. Billy, George, and Jake climbed into the truck. Angela stayed behind, the commander waiting at the base. They drove toward Union Hill Road, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. They knew the layout of every trailer. They knew where the dogs slept. They knew exactly who was inside. The first stop was the trailer belonging to Christopher Roden Sr. Inside, Chris Sr. and his cousin Gary were likely unwinding after a long day. The Wagners moved with a terrifying, practiced silence. Using a key they had likely acquired or simply knowing the door was unlocked, they slipped inside. Billy Wagner went first. He was the patriarch, the one who would take down the Rodens' leader. Chris Sr. wasn't asleep. He was in the kitchen when the door opened. There was a brief, violent struggle, the only one that would happen that night. Billy fired. Chris Sr. was hit multiple times in the head and torso. Gary Roden, caught in the crossfire, was executed where he stood. The silencers muffled the cracks of the .40 caliber bullets to nothing more than heavy thuds. As Chris Sr. lay dying on the floor, Billy and his sons didn't stop to look back. They had a schedule to keep. The next stop was Frankie's trailer just a few hundred feet away. Frankie and Hannah Gilly were asleep. The Wagners entered with the same ghostly precision. They walked past the room where the 3-year-old was sleeping. They entered the master bedroom. Frankie and Hannah never woke up. They were shot in the head as they lay side by side. Between them, 6-month-old Ruger was sleeping. The killers didn't touch him. They left him there, splattered with the blood of his parents, a silent witness to a horror he was too young to understand. From there, they moved down the road to Dana Roden's trailer. This was the home of the primary target, Hannah May. Inside were Dana, Hannah May, her newborn, and 16-year-old Chris Jr. The Wagners split up. Jake went for the room where Hannah May was sleeping with her 4-day-old daughter. He had once claimed to love this woman. He had fathered a child with her. But as he stood over her in the darkness, there was no hesitation. He fired 5 times. Hannah Mae Roden was killed instantly. Her 4-day-old daughter, Kylie, was tucked into her side. When the police found her hours later, the infant was still trying to nurse on her dead mother's breast. In the other rooms, Dana and Chris Jr. were also executed in their beds. The Wagners moved through the house like shadows, checking each pulse, ensuring the job was complete. The final stop was miles away, at the mobile home of Kenneth Roden. Kenneth was Chris Sr.'s brother. He lived alone, a quiet man who kept to himself. The Wagners drove the long stretch of dark road, the adrenaline of the night beginning to settle into a cold, hard resolve. They entered his home while he slept. A single shot to the head. Methodical, clinical, final. By 4 a.m., the Wagners were back at their farmhouse. They stripped off their clothes and shoes, feeding them into a fire. They cleaned the truck. They disassembled the silencers. They had successfully executed 8 people in 4 different locations in a single night. They believed they had committed the perfect crime. They believed they had saved Sophia. But as the sun began to rise over Pike County on the morning of April 22nd, the silence of Union Hill Road was about to be broken. Around 7:53 a.m., Bobby Jo Manley, Dana's sister, pulled into the driveway. She had come to feed the family's dogs. She walked into the first trailer, and the screaming began. A screaming that wouldn't stop for years. At approximately 7:50 a.m., Bobby Jo Manley, Dana Roden's sister, pulled her car into the gravel driveway of Christopher Roden Sr.'s trailer. This was her routine. She came every morning to help with the chores and feed the family's dogs. She expected to hear the familiar sounds of the morning, the barking of the hounds, the clatter of a coffee pot, Chris Sr.'s voice shouting a greeting. But as she stepped onto the porch, the silence felt wrong. It felt thick. She pushed the door open, and the world as she knew it simply ceased to exist. In the kitchen, the air was metallic and cold. Christopher Roden Sr. was on the floor. There was so much blood. So much that Bobby Jo initially thought he had been beaten or that an appliance had exploded. A few feet away, Chris's cousin, Gary, lay in a similar state of ruin. "There's blood all over the house. I think my brother-in-law is dead. He's on the floor. It looks like someone beat the hell out of him." Bobby Jo didn't wait for the sirens. She knew her nephew, Frankie, lived just down the road. She climbed back into her car, her tires spitting gravel as she raced toward his trailer. She was looking for help, but all she found was more shadow. She burst into Frankie's home, shouting his name. No answer. She pushed open the bedroom door and was met with a sight that would haunt the state of Ohio for a generation. Frankie Roden and his fiancée, Hannah Gilley, were dead in their bed. Between them, 6-month-old Ruger was awake. He was covered in his parents' blood, but he was alive. He was reaching for them, crying softly in a room that smelled of copper and gunpowder. "I'm at Frankie's now. They're both dead in here. There's 2 more. My nephew and his girlfriend. There's blood everywhere." When the first deputies arrived, they found a scene that defied logic. They began a sweep of the area, moving from one trailer to the next, their weapons drawn, expecting an active shooter to jump from the woods. But there was no shooter. There were only the quiet houses. At Dana Roden's trailer, the horror reached its zenith. Deputies found Dana, the family's heart, executed in her bed. In the next room, 16-year-old Chris Jr. had been killed. And then they reached the back bedroom. There lay Hannah Mae, 19 years old. The woman the Wagners had decided didn't deserve to breathe. Beside her was her 4-day-old daughter, Kylie. The infant was unharmed, a tiny living miracle in a house of the dead. 3-year-old Brentley was also found alive in another home, wandering through the trailers, looking for a mother who would never wake up. As the news spread, Pike County went into a state of total lockdown. Schools were closed. Businesses shuttered their windows. The local sheriff, Charles Reeder, stood before the cameras, his face pale, advising the remaining members of the Roden family to arm themselves. The message was clear. There was a monster in the woods, and no one knew where it would strike next. The search for answers was immediate and massive. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, took over the scenes, turning the quiet gravel roads into a high-tech fortress of yellow tape and forensic tents. It was the largest crime scene in Ohio history. Investigators spent 5 straight days processing the trailers, documenting every blood spatter, every footprint in the mud. But the perfect crime was holding. No shell casings were found. The brass catchers the Wagners used had worked perfectly. There were no fingerprints that didn't belong to the family. No DNA from an outsider. For the survivors, the search wasn't for evidence. It was for safety. The Rodens were a massive family, but suddenly they felt small. They gathered in hotels, protected by armed guards, wondering if they were next. They looked at their neighbors with suspicion. They looked at the hills and saw only hiding places. And a few miles away, the Wagners watched it all on the news. They watched the grieving families. They watched the helicopters circling. And they sat in their farmhouse, quiet and contained. They had the child they wanted. They had the silence they required. Or so they thought. The search was only just beginning, and it would eventually lead the authorities to a trail of Walmart receipts, dyed hair, and a family bond that was about to be tested by the weight of 8 lives. But for months, there was nothing but a haunting, heavy silence. The initial theory that gripped the media and the community was a professional hit. Because of the sophisticated nature of the killings, the silencers, the lack of shell casings, the clinical precision, authorities initially looked at the marijuana grow operations found on Christopher Roden Sr.'s property. They wondered if a cartel had moved in, sending a message to a local competitor. It made for a gripping headline, but for the lead investigators, something didn't sit right. Cartels are loud. They want the world to know they were there. But this was quiet. This was intimate. The killers had walked past high-value items. They had left thousands of dollars in cash untouched, and most importantly, they had spared the infants. A professional hit squad doesn't tuck a newborn into a dead mother's side. Only someone who valued those children would leave them alive. The focus began to shift from the hills to the family tree. Detectives started looking into the lives of the Rodens, looking for the friction points. And every road they traveled eventually led back to a single name, Sophia. As investigators dug into the digital life of Hannah Mae Roden, they found the evidence of a brewing war. They found the messages about her refusal to sign custody papers. They found the screenshots of the Wagners monitoring her every move. And then, they noticed something strange about the Wagners themselves. While the rest of the community was paralyzed by grief and fear, the Wagner family seemed busy. Within months of the murders, they did something that no one in Pike County could understand. They sold their farm, the legacy they had claimed to cherish, and they packed up their entire lives. In the spring of 2017, the closed circle of the Wagners didn't just move. They vanished. They drove 4,000 miles north across the Canadian border and into the frozen isolation of Alaska. To the Wagners, it was a fresh start. To the investigators, it was a neon sign of guilt. They didn't just leave, they ran. State and federal authorities began an unprecedented surveillance operation. They didn't just follow the Wagners to the wilderness. They listened. Using sophisticated wiretaps and hidden microphones planted in the Wagners' vehicles, detectives began to hear the cracks in the foundation. They didn't hear a direct confession. Not yet. But they heard a family speaking in codes. They heard Angela Wagner managing the story. They heard the tension between the brothers. But knowing isn't the same as proving. The BCI needed physical evidence, and the Wagners had been meticulous. The breakthrough finally came when investigators turned their attention to the months before the murders. They began combing through thousands of hours of surveillance footage from local businesses and scouring the digital footprints of the Wagner family's purchases. They found the smoking guns in the mundane records of big-box retailers. They discovered that Billy Wagner had purchased a very specific pair of faded glory shoes from a Walmart shortly before the killings, shoes with a tread pattern that perfectly matched a bloody print found on a floor at one of the Roden trailers. They found records of the family purchasing a 1990s Ford truck, a truck that was never seen again after the night of the massacre. And then they found the most chilling piece of the puzzle. Buried deep on the Wagner property, long after the family had moved to Alaska, investigators discovered a homemade silencer and a large, custom-built false floor for a trailer. The Wagners hadn't just committed the crime, they had built a mobile command center to carry it out. They had practiced their shots. They had studied the Rodens' sleep patterns like a military unit studying an enemy. In November 2018, the trap finally snapped shut. Billy, Angela, George IV, and Jake Wagner were arrested. The charges were staggering: 8 counts of aggravated murder, each carrying the possibility of the death penalty. The godmother of the family, Angela, was taken into custody along with her husband and sons. The investigation had revealed a terrifying truth. The Wagners had functioned as a domestic death squad. They had spent months planning the perfect erasure of another family, all to ensure that one little girl would grow up entirely within their control. They had weighed the lives of 8 people against their own desire for ownership, and they had decided the price was worth paying. But as the trial loomed, the closed circle was about to face its final test. Because while the Wagners were unified in blood, they weren't all unified in silence. The arrests of Billy, Angela, George IV, and Jake Wagner sent a shockwave through Ohio. It was the moment the community had been praying for, yet the horror was far from over. The legal battle that followed was as complex and grueling as the investigation itself. For nearly 3 years, the family maintained a united front, pleading not guilty, while the state meticulously built its case piece by piece, from Walmart receipts to homemade silencers. But on April 22, 2021, exactly 5 years to the day after the massacre, the closed circle finally broke. Jake Wagner, the man who had once claimed to love Hannah Mae Roden, walked into a courtroom and did the unthinkable. He took a deal. In exchange for the removal of the death penalty for himself and his family, Jake agreed to tell the truth. He sat in that witness stand and for hours reconstructed the nightmare. His confession was clinical, almost hauntingly detached. He described how they had studied the Rodens' habits, how they had calculated the exact time it took for the trailers to fall silent. He admitted to pulling the trigger on 5 of the 8 victims. He spoke about standing over Hannah Mae, the mother of his daughter, and firing into her head while their infant lay beside her. He confirmed the family's motive was purely, terrifyingly simple: absolute control over Sophia. The confession was a knife to the heart of the Wagner defense. Angela Wagner followed soon after, pleading guilty to conspiracy and burglary, admitting her role as the architect of the family's obsession. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence that ensures the matriarch will likely never breathe free air again. But George Wagner IV, the older brother, chose a different path. He refused to plead. His trial in late 2022 became a national spectacle, a window into the dark soul of a family that had turned into a cult of personality. For weeks, the prosecution laid out the evidence. They showed the kill truck. They presented the ballistics, and they brought Jake to the stand to testify against his own brother. George's defense was simple. He was there, but he didn't kill anyone. He claimed he was a victim of his family's dominance, a man who went along because he had no other choice. But the jury didn't buy it. In Ohio, if you help plan a murder, if you provide the transportation, if you stand guard while the triggers are pulled, you are just as guilty as the man with the gun. In December 2022, George Wagner IV was found guilty on all 22 counts, including 8 counts of aggravated murder. At his sentencing, the judge's words echoed through the silent courtroom. "You were a part of a family that decided they were judge, jury, and executioner. You didn't just kill individuals, you attempted to erase a bloodline." The final tally of justice was staggering. Jake Wagner, 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. George Wagner IV, 8 consecutive life sentences plus 121 years in prison. Angela Wagner, 30 years for her role as the mastermind. Billy Wagner, currently awaiting his own day in court, facing the same grim fate as his sons. The Wagners had wanted to own Sophia's future. Instead, they had traded their own lives for a legacy of infamy. They had built a fortress to keep the world out, but in the end, the walls they built became their prison cells. 8 lives taken, 3 children left to grow up in the shadow of a massacre, and a family that once lived by the code of blood is thicker than water now sits in separate cells, waiting for the end. They say an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. And looking at Pike County today, it's hard to disagree. The trailers are gone. The crime scenes have been cleared. But the silence that remains is different now. It's a silence filled with the weight of 8 lives taken for the sake of ownership. The Wagners will rot in their separate cells, surviving on the scraps of a legacy they burned to the ground. They are a family that was supposed to be a sanctuary, but instead, they became a cult of erasure. As for the Rodens, they remain a memory of a family that was loud and many and full of life, until they met a family that was quiet and few and full of death. Ultimately, the Pike County Massacre stands as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the woods. They're the ones sitting at the dinner table, whispering about loyalty and planning the unthinkable in the name of love. Because when a family decides that their blood is the only blood that matters, everyone else is just standing in the way. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Sometimes the most terrifying things don't happen in a dark alley, but just a few meters from your own home, in the very place where you feel safest. On October 28th, 2020, those few meters outside her house became a trap for Morgan Fox. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. In the middle of the night on October 28, 2020, in Stark County, Ohio, a resident named Cindy Rowe woke up to make a phone call. It was around 1:30 a.m., but for Cindy, this was routine. At least a couple of times a week, she would get up at that hour and call her 29-year-old daughter, Morgan Fox, to make sure she was awake and getting ready for work. The thing was, Morgan didn't live in a different time zone or another country. She was just a few minutes' drive from Cindy's house in the small town of North Canton. Morgan worked the night shift at a local FedEx ground facility, and her shift usually started at 2:30 a.m. Cindy knew her calls weren't strictly necessary. Morgan was a responsible employee and could wake up on her own. She had deliberately chosen night shifts to earn extra income. Morgan herself had become a mother at 21 and was now raising her 8-year-old daughter, Amelia, alone. Unfortunately, the girl's father played no part in her life, but Morgan was an excellent mother who did everything possible to give her child a better future. Morgan and Amelia weren't just mother and daughter, they were best friends. They played together, did makeup, and dressed up. Morgan worked incredibly hard, sometimes juggling multiple jobs. Her schedule was intense, but for her daughter's sake, she managed everything. The little family's life changed when Morgan was hired at FedEx. She started from the bottom, but her goal had always been career advancement. She worked hard, showed initiative, and it paid off. Recently, Morgan had been promoted to manager in the packaging department. Now she had a stable income and could quit all her other side jobs. By coincidence, stability wasn't the only positive outcome of that job. There she met her boyfriend, Jason Scarnisi. Jason was also a single parent raising a young daughter. Although he later left FedEx and started working elsewhere, his relationship with Morgan continued. About 4 months earlier, the couple had rented a new house with plenty of space and a large backyard for the girls to play. Family life was starting out wonderfully. Still, Morgan had grown up accustomed to a big family. When she was the same age Amelia is now, her mother remarried. Morgan already had 5 siblings, and her stepfather had 7 more children. She grew up in a huge but loving blended family. Now that Morgan was living with Jason and the 2 girls, she hoped to recreate the same cozy home atmosphere. So, on October 28, 2020, Morgan's mother, Cindy, called her in the night to check if she was getting ready for work. She was very proud of her daughter's achievements and simply wanted to hear her voice one more time. Morgan reassured her, saying she was already preparing to leave. They talked for a minute and then said goodbye. There was nothing unusual about the conversation. Morgan and Cindy had done this dozens, if not hundreds of times, but neither of them knew it would be their last call to each other. The silence of that night was deceptive. It was shattered only twice by sharp, dry pops that echoed across the neat driveways of the sleeping neighborhood. After that, it became quiet again, too quiet for what had just happened. About 5 hours later, at around 6:30 a.m. on October 28th, the Stark County Emergency Services received a 911 call. The caller said he needed police and medical help. He explained that he was heading to work when he noticed his girlfriend's car outside the house on Fraser Avenue. She was motionless in the front seat, unconscious and covered in blood. Since he couldn't feel a pulse, he was almost certain she was dead. His name was Jason Scarnisi. He was Morgan Fox's boyfriend. Stark County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene and confirmed the woman had died. A bullet hole was found in the passenger door, but no shell casings were present. Investigators concluded that Morgan had been killed by 2 shots to the head from behind. One bullet struck near her left ear, the other closer to the crown of her head. Either wound could have been fatal, meaning it wasn't an accident. An autopsy later confirmed she had been shot twice. Based on the position of her body, with her legs still outside the vehicle, investigators determined the attack occurred as she sat in her dark gray Ford SUV while getting ready to leave for work. She never managed to drive away. This immediately raised questions. Why would someone shoot Morgan? Who could she have wronged so badly that the killer didn't hesitate to take her life? Robbery as a motive was quickly ruled out. Her purse was still on her shoulder, and cash was lying on the center console. Her personal items were scattered on the driveway near her body, further indicating the attacker wasn't after money or valuables. Investigators theorized the crime had a personal motive and appeared to be a planned ambush. Additional evidence was found behind Morgan's house. On the roadside in the grass near a white fence were tire tracks. Though the prints were unclear due to wet ground, it was obvious someone had parked there. Judging by the mud on the fence, it seemed the person left in a hurry. Police considered that this could have been the killer. The parking spot was strategically advantageous, hidden by the fence but offering a clear view of Morgan's house and SUV. However, weather conditions prevented a full picture. Heavy rain that morning likely washed away much of the physical evidence. Morgan was shot as she was leaving for work, sometime between 2 and 2:15 a.m., and police arrived around 7 a.m. Despite this, authorities had one key advantage. Morgan's cell phone was found on the driveway and immediately sent to the crime lab in hopes of finding more leads. Since the caller was Morgan's boyfriend and the first to report her death, authorities were eager to speak with him for more details. They already knew the basics, but asked Jason to come to the sheriff's office for a follow-up interview and requested permission to examine his phone. During the interview, Jason Scarnisi shared more about the events leading up to the crime. He explained that on the evening of October 27th, Morgan, as usual, dropped Amelia off at her mother's. She did this whenever she had a night shift. According to Jason, He and Morgan went to bed around 9:30 p.m. so she could get some sleep. Morgan woke up around 1:30 a.m. and started getting ready. Jason kept sleeping since he didn't have to leave for several more hours. His alarm woke him at around 7 a.m., and he assumed Morgan had long since left. Everything changed when he went downstairs. While making breakfast, Jason glanced out the window and saw Morgan's SUV still in the driveway. He set down the groceries and went outside to check. Only then did he realize something terrible had happened. He immediately called 911. A neighbor who noticed the commotion contacted Morgan's mother, Cindy. Cindy rushed to her daughter's house, hoping for the best, but was horrified to see the home surrounded by police and cordoned off with tape. Stepping out of her car, she learned the devastating news. Her daughter was dead. At that point, detectives began asking general questions about Jason and Morgan's relationship, how long they had been together, what their relationship was like, whether they argued. Jason explained they started dating shortly after meeting in the summer of 2019. They had been together a little over a year, and everything was going great. Of course, they had disagreements like any couple, but nothing serious. They lived together and were in the process of blending their families, so the relationship was quite strong. Detectives asked these questions not out of mere curiosity. They wanted to know if Jason had any involvement in Morgan's death. They had some suspicions about him, and certain things stood out. First, detectives noted Jason's behavior during the 911 call and after police arrived. He seemed strangely calm to investigators, standing with a stone-faced expression. Despite his girlfriend having just been shot, he showed no emotion. Naturally, this could have been shock. He hadn't yet processed the full weight of the tragedy. But there were other inconsistencies. Investigators were surprised that Jason Scarnisi hadn't heard any shots that night. Then, when asked to come to the station for questioning, he pointed to his bare feet and asked permission to put on socks before leaving. Since the house and surrounding area were sealed off, detectives couldn't let him go inside alone. Someone had to accompany him. Hearing this, Jason suddenly changed his mind and said he didn't need the socks anymore. This made detectives wonder if he was trying to hide something. By this point, other investigators had started examining Jason's phone. They found several messages, including an exchange with Morgan from a few weeks earlier, about an argument that turned physical. From the texts, it appeared Morgan had hit Jason, but police had to consider all possibilities, especially since some messages were harsh. In one, Jason wrote that he hated Morgan and would never forgive her for that behavior. Jason explained to investigators that he was angry at the time and had over-dramatized, but a couple of days later, he and Morgan made up and agreed never to bring up the incident again. Though Jason appeared calm and somewhat detached outwardly, a couple of hours into the interview, he broke down in tears. Apparently, only then did it sink in that he had lost the love of his life. By the end of the questioning, Jason Scarnisi looked genuinely distraught and let his emotions out. When the interview ended, police left unsure what to think. They couldn't rule Jason out as a suspect, but there was no solid evidence against him. They initially hoped other team members would find something, but unfortunately, that front brought bad news too. No evidence was found at the crime scene, either washed away by rain or the killer was very careful. The same happened when officers canvassed the neighborhood for doorbell cameras or surveillance systems. Despite residents' willingness to provide footage, nothing useful turned up. As for the key evidence, Morgan's phone, the news was mixed. Though the device was made to work, the data port was damaged, preventing direct extraction. Instead, they had to manually review the victim's phone records. Now they had a solid theory of what happened to Morgan Fox, but no idea why, and no evidence to support it. The investigation stalled, leaving sheriff's detectives in a difficult position. Fortunately, authorities had one important resource: Morgan's loved ones. As it turned out, they had their own perspective. Family members said Morgan was someone who had no enemies. On the contrary, she easily made friends and always brought light and energy to those around her. She was someone you could rely on and everyone wanted nearby. However, According to loved ones, there was one exception. Lately at work, Morgan had faced a campaign of harassment from several male co-workers. It started with harmless pranks, someone taking items from her desk or moving them. But over time, it worsened. One day, Morgan overheard the guys talking about her appearance and clothing, making inappropriate comments. She tried reporting it to HR and other FedEx staff, but the problem was that some of the harassing men were also managers. In the end, instead of help, she received a warning for dress code violation. Despite the difficulties, Morgan managed most of the time, but everything changed a couple of weeks before her death. On October 8th, during a shift, Morgan noticed her phone was missing. At first, she thought she lost it, but after talking to co-workers, it turned out 3 men who had been tormenting her stole it, read her personal messages, and viewed her gallery photos. Unfortunately, Morgan had intimate photos and videos on the phone that became fodder for mockery. Naturally, she felt violated and immediately reported it to management. But no one took action. Morgan got the impression the other male managers were protecting the guys. According to family, she wasn't going to tolerate such brazen invasion of her privacy and was determined to fight it. With help from a female co-worker, Morgan was preparing a more serious harassment complaint and planned to go beyond her FedEx office to corporate HR. She drafted a detailed letter but never sent it. When Morgan's family learned of her death, they immediately recalled the troubling workplace situation and wondered if someone she named in the complaint was responsible. Detectives were sure the family suspected something and went to the FedEx ground facility to speak with management and co-workers. Soon they had a substantial list of people to check. Anyone who had previously harassed Morgan was now a potential suspect. They started with the 3 men who stole the phone. One of them, Jason McDermott, drew particular attention since Morgan recovered her phone from him. Detectives brought him in for questioning, but his story didn't match the facts. McDermott claimed he and Morgan were friends. He said he accidentally found the device, saw her lingerie photos, immediately turned it off, and returned it. When asked about Morgan's workplace issues, McDermott said she had conflicts with other managers and named a couple. He also claimed he genuinely cared for Morgan and had nothing to do with her death. She had recently complained to him about her boyfriend Jason Scarnisi, who had also worked at FedEx. But other co-workers said McDermott wasn't just a friend. He was attracted to Morgan and possibly hoped for more. After the phone incident, she was very upset with him. So if there had been a friendship, it ended on October 8th. Though police had suspicions about McDermott, his phone's location data showed he was in another part of town, at home, the night of the attack. He arrived at work at 3 a.m., confirmed by FedEx security cameras, worked his usual shift, and according to colleagues, behaved normally. Still, investigators didn't rush to clear McDermott and moved on to checking other co-workers. Nearly everyone they spoke to at FedEx had a solid alibi for the time of the shooting. One by one, almost all of Morgan's colleagues were removed from the suspect list. By the time detectives finished, only 2 names remained: Jason Scarnisi, Morgan's boyfriend, and Jason McDermott, her co-worker friend. But which of these men was actually responsible for Morgan's death, and why? Detectives weren't sure, but they had a hunch. If they wanted to solve this case, the answers lay in the digital evidence. Their suspicions were soon confirmed. The truth was far stranger and more horrifying than they imagined. Investigators refocused on the 2 Jasons, carefully re-examining any evidence they might have missed. Fortunately, they could now thoroughly review Morgan's phone contents, and what they found was telling. First, detectives were concerned about texts between Jason Scarnisi and Morgan where he mentioned her hitting him. But studying the messages and relationship context, they realized it was an exception. Though they argued like any couple, they were happy together, and there were no signs Jason had a motive to want her dead. As for not hearing the shots, it turned out Scarnisi wasn't alone. No neighbors police spoke to heard anything suspicious that night. Detectives explained the odd behavior after obtaining a search warrant for the house. In Jason's sock drawer, they found a small bag of marijuana. That's why he didn't want police looking there. The more investigators studied Morgan's boyfriend, the clearer his behavior became. Things that initially seemed suspicious had reasonable explanations upon review. But the same couldn't be said for Jason McDermott. When police reviewed Morgan's texts with him, they found their relationship wasn't as he described. Despite claiming no romantic feelings, his actions suggested otherwise. Jason McDermott was the guy stuck in the friend zone hoping for more. He clearly missed hints and constantly messaged Morgan with various excuses, for example, offering to buy her food or drinks at work. Most conversations were friendly. Everything changed on October 8th, when Morgan learned McDermott not only participated in stealing her phone, but lied about it. She said she wanted nothing more to do with him. After that, Jason bombarded her with apologies, but she made clear she wasn't interested. That's when events took a tragic turn. On October 24th, 4 days before the tragedy, Morgan went out of state to visit family. During the trip, she received a message from McDermott asking how her family was doing. Morgan hadn't told anyone at work about her plans, so she was shocked by the question. Frightened, she asked how he knew, and then blocked his number. Investigators suspected McDermott might have been stalking Morgan, and this was confirmed by 2 new details. It turned out Morgan wasn't the only female co-worker who complained about him. Just a few months earlier, in June 2020, another young woman named Sienna Clemens filed a complaint against McDermott. Sienna started at FedEx in 2019 at age 18, and Jason became her mentor. At first, their relationship was friendly. When Sienna lost her driver's license, she asked McDermott for rides to work. He gladly agreed. This went on for months. But once Sienna regained her license and no longer needed help, his behavior changed dramatically. Jason obsessively followed her social media, liking and commenting on every post. If ignored, he bombarded her with messages. She asked him to stop, but he persisted. One day it escalated. Sienna was at a meeting when she looked out the window and saw McDermott in his car on the parking lot watching her. She realized he was stalking her. She filed a complaint, but like with Morgan, nothing was done. About a month later, Sienna was called into a manager's office and fired. The second alarming discovery concerned McDermott's behavior after Morgan's death. Family said a few days after the crime, co-workers held a memorial service right outside Morgan's house. Cindy learned of it while picking up items with Amelia. She was caught off guard. The vigil was held without family knowledge. But what happened next was worse. As Cindy and Amelia returned to their car, Jason McDermott suddenly appeared. He handed Amelia a small stuffed toy, saying he didn't want her to forget him, then touched her hair and said how beautiful she was. Cindy screamed for him to get away, but he ignored her. They only managed to leave after another man pulled McDermott away. Cindy admitted this wasn't her first negative encounter with her daughter's coworker, but even this wasn't the most disturbing information authorities learned about Jason McDermott. Detectives thoroughly examined data from his phone and were, to put it mildly, shocked. Initially interested in his location the night of the attack, once they learned more about his feelings toward Morgan, they dug deeper. It turned out McDermott wasn't just interested in Morgan Fox, he was obsessed with her. Only after reviewing photos and videos on Jason's phone did detectives grasp the depth of this obsession. His device held dozens of clips and images downloaded from Morgan's social media, but worst of all, McDermott used them in chats with another man. Reviewing all phone data, authorities found Jason had a Skype account where he built an entire fantasy life with one user. Messages claimed he and Morgan were in a relationship. Moreover, McDermott pretended to be a woman in a same-sex relationship. He used a fake username and Morgan's stolen photos, videos, as proof she was his girlfriend. Detectives were convinced they had found the person responsible for Morgan Fox's death. But to prove Jason McDermott's guilt, they needed stronger evidence than disturbing photos and videos. They had to link him to the actual crime. Since no direct evidence was at the scene, investigators compared tire tracks in the mud by the roadside to McDermott's car wheels. Tire width, tread depth, and wheelbase weren't conclusive, but raised questions. During the first interview, Jason's car looked unusually clean, as if recently washed. Odd given the heavy rain on October 28th. Why wash a car in that weather? Police investigated and obtained surveillance footage from a gas station near FedEx showing McDermott going through an automated car wash. Phone location evidence for the night of the shooting was also explainable. Given how Jason behaved, detectives figured he was smart enough to leave his phone at home to avoid suspicion. But McDermott didn't anticipate how thoroughly authorities would search surveillance footage. Though nothing was found on Fraser Avenue, they located fragments from traffic cameras near the crime scene that night. The footage captured Jason McDermott's car heading toward Morgan's house at 1:38 a.m. and returning to his apartment at 2:17 a.m., exactly matching when Morgan would have been leaving for work. Putting all evidence together, investigators believed they had solid proof of Jason's guilt. On November 4th, 2020, a week after Morgan's death, he was arrested. At trial the following spring, McDermott denied any involvement in his co-worker's death. But everything pointed to this man being obsessed with Morgan, stalking her, harassing her, and invading her privacy while harboring delusional hopes of romance. The collapse of Jason McDermott's fantasy finally broke him. When the woman, learning he betrayed her trust and rifled through her phone, ended their friendship and cut off contact, he couldn't cope with the rejection and decided to take revenge by taking her life. On the night of October 28, 2020, Jason McDermott drove to Morgan's house. He parked by the neighbor's fence so she wouldn't notice and waited for her to leave for work. As soon as she came out and headed to her SUV, Jason quietly followed. He shot Morgan twice in the back of the head and fled, then acted normal at work. In the days after, McDermott tried to portray himself as a grieving friend and helpful person. He even posted a long social media tribute to Morgan, expressing condolences to her family and friends and saying how much he missed her. But the trial led to the inevitable. The jury found Jason McDermott guilty of murder and stalking-related charges, sentencing him to life in prison without parole. A story that began as an ordinary autumn morning turned into a shattered world. But its ending isn't just a line in a court record. Morgan's parents, enduring unimaginable grief and enduring the trial, left the courthouse. The killer received his sentence. Justice prevailed. Yet one detail haunted Morgan's family. After learning what hell she went through at work, they immediately sued FedEx, claiming management ignored her harassment and bullying complaints. In the end, FedEx paid $4 million to the family. That money won't bring back a mother to her daughter, but it will at least secure little Amelia's future and force the company to rethink workplace relationship policies. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Surely many of you have watched the American psychological horror film Orphan. At the center of the plot is a married couple who, after the death of their unborn child, adopted a 9-year-old girl from an orphanage. In the end, the little girl turned out to be not at all who she pretended to be. But this is by no means fiction. The heroine Esther has a prototype. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Today's story began in a small fishing town of Kuzim in the southeast of the Czech Republic. Only about 11,000 people lived there. It was an unremarkable little town until one horrific incident occurred there. On the morning of May 7, 2007, Edward, the father of the family, was in a state of panic. His wife was giving birth, and he was expecting a phone call from the hospital any minute. Edward was at home and, to distract himself, tried to keep busy with chores. He sat in the nursery and set up the baby monitor. It was the best model that Edward and his wife could afford. The man connected the receiver to the monitor, adjusted a clear image, and expected to see the crib standing right in front of him, which he had assembled all day. But the screen showed something completely different from what Edward saw with his own eyes. The image on the receiver did not match the real picture. Instead of the crib, the man saw a boy about 6 to 7 years old. Judging by the gloomy room, the child was in some kind of basement. The boy looked calm, but his hands were tied with duct tape. There was no clothing on him. He was completely naked. Edward twisted the receiver's knob, and the image finally changed, showing the nursery in their house with his wife. This time, everything was correct. Edward decided that it was some kind of glitch and tried to forget about the strange picture. Perhaps the receiver picked up someone else's signal that had nothing to do with reality. But the vision wouldn't leave his head. The man tried to understand what had happened, where the child appeared on the monitor instead of the nursery inhabiting the basement, but he couldn't find an explanation. At that moment, the phone rang. The hospital reported that he had a daughter and that his wife and the baby were fine. The new father immediately headed to the maternity ward. When he returned home, he tried to catch the strange broadcast from someone else's basement again. Edward twisted the receiver's knob until the boy appeared on the monitor. Although several hours had passed, his hands were still tied. Edward understood the full seriousness of what was happening on the baby monitor screen. He pressed record in case he lost the signal or something happened. Then the man called the police and told them that while connecting the device, he accidentally stumbled upon someone's basement where a child was being held. The police responded very quickly. Edward still hoped that it was some kind of mistake and the situation would soon resolve in the best way. But since everything looked as if the boy was being held in the basement by force, they couldn't take risks. The man showed the arriving officers the strange picture on the baby monitor screen and once again outlined the situation. The police couldn't ignore such things and began to act immediately. Since the baby monitor signal is usually quite weak, the source had to be somewhere nearby. Edward reported that he had never seen this boy from the basement before. He knew that the neighbors had a teenage daughter and 2 young sons, but he hadn't seen them for a long time. The police decided to check the neighbors' houses, but they didn't have to go far. In the very first house, they were met by 30-year-old Klara Mawarova and her sister, 32-year-old Katarzyna Mawarova, a social worker. The women were very polite. They explained that only their 13-year-old adopted daughter Anichka lived in the house, who didn't like communicating with strangers. The police asked for permission to inspect the house, and although the hostesses didn't like it, they agreed. While walking around the dwelling, the officers didn't find the girl, but their attention was drawn to a locked door to the basement in the back of the building. Klara said that she never went down there because the owner of the house didn't leave her a key. The police left, believing the women only halfway. Returning to Edward's house, they asked to turn on the monitor again. Rewinding the recorded material, the officers noticed something unusual. The recording played the same music that was in the sisters' house. Turning the volume knob to full power, they heard Klara's voice and the voice of one of the officers. It was the very conversation they had with Edward's neighbor a few minutes ago. That's how they learned that the camera whose image accidentally appeared on the baby monitor screen was installed in the Mawarova's house. The police immediately returned to Klara's house and demanded to be let into the basement. They were sure that the unknown person was being held there by force. At that moment, Klara's 13-year-old adopted daughter Anichka appeared near the doors. However, the girl looked significantly younger than her age. Anichka crawled out on all fours, screaming "Mommy," like a very small child. Instead of approaching her adoptive mother Klara, she clung to Katarzyna like an infant. The police assumed that Anichka might have developmental delays and continued trying to break into the basement door. But suddenly, the frightened little girl with huge, trustingly wide-open eyes jumped up and rushed between the police and the door, trying to stop them. In the end, The officers had to call workers with tools to get to the lower floor of the Maurova sisters' house. As soon as the basement door opened, an unbearable stench immediately enveloped everyone present. Then a horrific sight opened to the rescuers' eyes, which none of them would ever forget. In the dark, dirty, and damp basement was a little boy. In reality, the situation looked much worse than on the tiny receiver screen of the baby monitor. His name was Andrzej Mauer. He was Klara's 8-year-old son, but he wasn't alone. The police also found another boy, Andrzej's older brother, 10-year-old Jakub. The conditions in the basement were beyond horror. The kids were frozen and severely weakened, but despite this, both turned out to be calm and pleasant children. When the rescuers approached Andrzej, he simply raised his eyes and smiled. Klara and Katarzyna were immediately taken into custody for child abuse. The story of 2 underage victims locked in the basement immediately became public knowledge. Reporters flocked to the previously quiet little town to see the house of horrors with their own eyes. No national news outlet left this case unattended. The story caused horror and bewilderment. How could someone cause so much pain and suffering to their own children? The kids were sent to an orphanage to assess their physical and mental condition. They showed themselves to be surprisingly resilient, kind, polite children. They also eagerly grabbed toys and were ready to learn something new. But Anichka, although older than the brothers, behaved like a spoiled child. She threw tantrums and continued to persistently demand meetings with Klara and Aunt Katarzyna. The police assumed that Anichka had a developmental delay. Perhaps the teenage girl, like her younger brothers, had been subjected to some kind of violence. And then something unexpected happened. Anichka disappeared. The 13-year-old teenager escaped from the children's center. She climbed out of a window that a child could hardly open and vanished. Large-scale searches began. Meanwhile, the police and social workers desperately tried to find out from Jakub and Andrzej what was happening in their home. For what reason Klara's 2 sons ended up locked in the basement, the investigators were only able to partially reconstruct the picture of what happened over the past few years. And these were horrors beyond comprehension. What the kids went through turned out to be much worse than anyone could imagine. The family where Klara and Katarzyna were raised was very religious. They went to church every Sunday. The girls attended Sunday school and were raised in strict accordance with the 10 Commandments. During their teenage years, the sisters' interest in religion became a bit extreme. The girls began to have dreams where they were chosen ones. But Klara believed that it was her destiny to fulfill God's mission. She talked about it all the time and thought that she had divine powers and that she had to achieve something greater in this life. One day the parents caught her trying to suffocate her sister Katarzyna with a pillow, assuring that she could then bring her back to life on her own. Fortunately, the adults intervened before a tragedy occurred. At school, teachers and social workers noticed that the girls had unusual symptoms. Klara and Katarzyna claimed that they possessed superhuman powers and were God's chosen ones. These statements caused concern. Suspicions intensified when the girls started having hallucinations. The educators assumed that Klara and Katarzyna might have developed a mental illness, and they advised the parents to show their daughters to specialists for examination and possible treatment. However, Klara and Katarzyna's mother categorically rejected this idea. She didn't want to hear anything about possible problems and flatly refused to take the girls to a psychiatrist. Instead, the mother took her daughters out of school and transferred them to another educational institution. So the sisters' mental state, likely related to some disorder without treatment, continued to deteriorate. In the mid-90s, Klara turned 18. For some reason, she distanced herself from the family and stopped communicating with her sister Katarzyna. During this same period, she began a relationship with an adult man named Radek, which soon turned into marriage. It was during that period that the couple had 2 children, Jakub and Andrzej. Initially, their family was happy. They lived in an apartment. Klara studied at university, majoring in economics, and then got a job as a secretary. Everything was going great. Clara was a wonderful mother to her sons. The boys grew up in abundance, surrounded by care and attention. Their father, Radek, was a caring and loving husband. Life in the family was happy and prosperous. However, as mentioned earlier, there were suspicions that Clara suffered from an undiagnosed mental disorder. Several years later, when the woman turned 26, her condition began to worsen. She started having delusional ideas and visions again about fulfilling God's mission. Clara began to believe that her husband and children distracted her from this mission and prevented her from fulfilling her destiny. She started voicing her dissatisfactions to her husband, which led to numerous quarrels and arguments. In the end, her spouse couldn't take it and filed for divorce. Clara took the children and unexpectedly reunited with her sister Katarzyna for everyone. They moved to a separate apartment, and at first, it seemed that the parents' divorce didn't particularly affect the children. But everything changed with the appearance of Aniczka. Aniczka was from Norway. Katarzyna, Clara's sister, met the girl in 2006 when she worked as a social worker. Aniczka was orphaned at an early age. Both her parents died. She changed several orphanages where she experienced cruel violence, and then she was sold to child molesters, where she became a victim of monstrous abuses and tortures. One day, she managed to escape. She ended up safe. However, it soon turned out that the girl had leukemia, and the chances of living to 16 were practically non-existent. Her health was extremely fragile. Learning about the difficult fate and health problems, Katarzyna took pity on the girl and convinced her sister Clara to adopt Aniczka to provide her with care and support. Katarzyna also found a specialist doctor for the girl who regularly examined her and gave treatment recommendations. Although Aniczka's adoptive mother was Clara, her sister forbade her to take her daughter to the hospital. Katarzyna took this responsibility entirely upon herself. The doctor communicated with Clara only by phone and email, sending messages and emails with instructions on how to care for Aniczka and how to treat her ailments. For example, during one of the girl's long hospital stays, the doctor called the adoptive mother and said that she needed to talk to Aniczka. Although she was unconscious and unlikely to hear her, Clara did everything to help her, despite not understanding what it was for. But this was not the strangest instruction the doctor gave to Klara Mauerova. For a long time, it seemed that Katarzyna knew much more about what was happening with Aniczka than her adoptive mother. Katarzyna took the girl to the hospital, constantly met with the doctor. But Clara took it calmly, allowing her sister to care for the newly acquired niece. One day, the doctor wrote a text message to the adoptive mother. For Aniczka to recover from her traumatic past, she needed to be given a lot of love, affection, and attention. Tell her more often how wonderful she is, praise her every day, and buy gifts. Clara did everything she could. It felt like, having ended up in the adoptive family, the schoolgirl decided to squeeze everything possible out of her parents. Although Aniczka had no medical problems with her legs, she constantly demanded to be carried in arms like a little one. If Clara refused something, the girl threw explosive tantrums. She also threatened to leave this world if she didn't get what she wanted. Worst of all, the specialist treating the teenager for leukemia encouraged such behavior. One of the doctor's instructions was to give Aniczka a full-body massage at night, paying special attention to intimate parts. The adoptive mother did as she was told, but the doctor stated that the treatment wasn't helping because Clara's sons, who were 5 and 7 years old at the time, treated the girl badly. Aniczka herself seemed to feel extreme dislike for the 2 other children. She didn't want her mother to pay attention to her own sons, and the doctor supported the young patient again. The doctor directly told Clara that she needed to raise her sons more strictly, and Aniczka allegedly suffered because of the negative attitude, and this delayed her recovery. In general, the doctor advised the woman to use physical punishment for her sons more often. Only in this case would her adopted daughter find peace and recover. And Clara began punishing Andrzej and Jakub. At first, these were small things. The boys were made to stand on their knees in one place for hours without the ability to move. They were locked in a closet without light, without food, and without a toilet. They were beaten for the slightest offense. Despite the fact that the intensity of the punishments constantly increased, the doctor insisted that it wasn't enough, that the mother needed to hit harder. And Clara began treating her sons with even greater cruelty. And then Clara was convinced that Andrzej and Jakub were real monsters, and Clara should forget that these were her own children. Aniczka constantly complained to her adoptive mother that the boys behaved rudely with her, which made her suffer greatly. However, she herself insisted that Clara beat them harder. Incredibly, the woman obeyed and began physically punishing her sons for the most insignificant misdeeds. For some reason, Clara always believed Aniczka and gradually began turning away from her own children, taking the side of the 13-year-old adopted daughter in everything. In addition to Clara starting to neglect her sons and focusing all her attention on Aniczka, she also stopped taking care of herself. She stopped eating normally and caring for her appearance. She stopped showering, lost a lot of weight, and looked like a shadow of her former self. She slept 3 hours a day, didn't communicate with friends and relatives. And all this because of the teenage girl who, although still a child, behaved very calculatingly. The 13-year-old schoolgirl's eyes reflected a rich life experience, saying that in her years she had seen much more than some adults. But even that wasn't enough. The doctor treating Aniczka said that allegedly Andrzej needed shock therapy too. First of all, the doctor advised Clara that the boys needed to be isolated from external influences. This meant they had to be taken out of school. Clara did just that. Now her sons were homeschooled, and they were not allowed to communicate with other family members. The boys were forbidden to see their father, with whom they met every other weekend, as well as their grandmother and grandfather, with whom they were incredibly close. At the doctor's instruction, Clara took her 2 sons to a cottage in the forest wilderness, and there the real hell began for the boys. The doctor called this place a re-education camp. In this cottage were 3 people: 29-year-old Jan Turek, 26-year-old Hanna Basheva, and 23-year-old Jan Skurlova. They were so-called mentors. While Clara, Katarzyna, and Aniczka slept in comfort and had a great time, the boys were forced to sleep in dog cages where they couldn't even stand up to full height. Jakub and Andrzej were practically not fed, so they couldn't even resist. Bags were put over their heads, they were beaten with whatever came to hand. Their skin was scratched with sharp forks, cigarettes were extinguished on them. Their heads were repeatedly plunged into buckets of water or doused with boiling water. These cruel punishments were carried out by the 3 mentors who lived in the cottage, as well as Aniczka and Katarzyna. And then Clara joined them, whose brain was so washed that she no longer saw her own sons in them. Now Clara saw them as little spawns of hell and did everything to set them on the true path. They were abused not only physically, but also morally, and they wanted to turn them against each other. They were ordered to fight and harm each other. One day, the older one was forced to dig his own grave and lie in it, pretending to be dead. Then they brought out the younger one and convinced him that it was all his fault, after which they ordered him to fill the grave with dirt. It was very scary. Andrzej burst into tears, and they calmed him by saying that allegedly he could be brought back to life, but only if the younger one behaved well. Soon after Jakub and Andrzej returned from the cottage in September 2006, where they spent several months, Clara began the official adoption of Aniczka. In fact, the adoption court never saw the real Aniczka. Instead, Katarzyna brought the daughter of one of the neighbors to the hearing so that she could pretend to be the orphan. At this time, Clara and Katarzyna rented a large house in a small town. Aniczka had her own room there, very beautifully furnished, with a bunch of toys, clothes, and everything a teenage girl could dream of. But the tortures over Clara's own sons continued. Instead of a room, they were placed in the basement. The walls of the room were lined with soundproofing so that no one would hear the screams, and the windows were boarded up. The kids weren't let out to the toilet, so they relieved themselves in the same little room. For this, they were also punished, forced to eat their own excrement and vomit. They had to sleep on the hard floor. The only means of hygiene was a bucket of cold water that was poured over Jakub and Andrzej. The culmination of the inhuman treatment was eating flesh. At the order of the same Aniczka and the mysterious doctor, Klara, without any anesthetic, cut off a piece of flesh from the buttocks of one of her sons and then cauterized the wound with a cigarette butt. There were several versions of what they did with the flesh. Either they ate it themselves or fed it to the prisoners. In any case, it was horrible. Jakub and Andrzej acted as martyrs who were supposedly to atone for the sins of humanity. It all ended when in May 2007, a neighbor, setting up a baby monitor bought for his child, accidentally connected to the camera installed in the house where the Maurovas lived. Why Klara agreed to participate in the abuses of her own sons is unknown. Perhaps the reason was an undetected mental disorder. She was a stupid, naive, and easily manipulated woman whom they managed to convince that her children were monsters. Her sister Katarzyna was part of the manipulation. She knew much more than she said and, apparently, simply enjoyed torturing her nephews. Katarzyna hid from her sister Klara the real information about Aniczka and the strange doctor, about the people from the cottage in the forest. So, the police freed Jakub and Andrzej from the horrific basement. Now they were safe. The kids underwent a long course of rehabilitation and were able to return to normal life. A little recovered from the experienced horror, Jakub and Andrzej told the officers what happened to them, and that's when the authorities learned about the scale of the abuses and tortures these kids were subjected to. But the 13-year-old Aniczka managed to escape from the temporary detention center. She couldn't be found anywhere. And that's not surprising, because in fact, there was no Aniczka. Initially, the investigators thought the girl was one of the victims, but a lot of effort was spent on her search, as it was believed that Aniczka was kidnapped right from the shelter. But then a letter arrived at the police in which Aniczka claimed that her mother Klara was innocent. And Andrzej and Jakub were brazenly lying, saying that they were held in the basement. Of course, the investigators didn't believe the letter, since they saw with their own eyes what the kids went through. But something in this message seemed suspicious to them. The police noticed that the grammar, style, and language were too mature for a 13-year-old teenager, and this caused them serious suspicions. Now the authorities began searching for Aniczka with even greater zeal. They posted her photos all over the city. One of the calls that came to the police station really shocked them. At that moment, the investigators learned that the girl Aniczka never actually existed. Aniczka's real name is Barbara Skurlova, and she wasn't a 13-year-old teenager. She was a 33-year-old woman, a couple of years older than her adoptive mother, Klara. She, like the heroine of the film Orphan, suffered from a rare disease, hypopituitarism, which stopped body growth and preserved childlike proportions. Hypopituitarism is an endocrine disorder associated with insufficient hormone production. But the film didn't compare at all to what happened in reality. Barbara Skurlova was born on July 20th, 1974, and was the eldest of 3 children. From childhood, she suffered from many problems related to mental health. In particular, she was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia. Barbara grew up in the Czech Republic, in a family where her mother was an alcoholic, and her father was practically absent all the time. Because of this, the girl felt lonely and abandoned. Because of the rare disease hypopituitarism, Barbara's pituitary gland didn't produce enough growth hormones, which led to delayed physical development. Outwardly, she looked much younger than her peers, and adults often treated her like a child. Barbara couldn't come to terms with such treatment and began using her condition for manipulations. She pretended to be an orphan in need of care and attention so that adults would help her and let her into their homes. In her teenage years, Barbara deceived one family with her unhappy appearance, who agreed to adopt the poor girl. However, during the procedure, the deception was revealed, and Barbara was sent for treatment to a psychiatric hospital. Having escaped from the clinic, the girl tried to do the same with another family. The deception was revealed again, and this time, Barbara's own parents sent her to another psychiatric institution for treatment, where she had to spend a long period of time. Barbara was discharged from the hospital when she was already over 20 years old. Barbara met Clara's sister, Katarzyna, at work in a social center. They were almost the same age and immediately found a common language. Everything was going normally until Barbara, starving for attention, wanted to become a child again. But last time, when she pretended to be an orphan, she was exposed. The woman didn't want to return to the psychiatric hospital, so she decided to share her plans with her friend Katarzyna. Any sane person in Katarzyna's place would probably refuse, but she unexpectedly agreed. None of the colleagues even guessed where Barbara Skrylova suddenly disappeared, and meanwhile, she was diligently working with her friend to look like a child. Barbara went to extreme measures. She lost a lot of weight, losing more than half her weight, to look younger. She started dressing in bright children's clothes with cartoon characters. In addition, she had breast reduction surgery or vacuum aspiration. She was ready for anything to turn into a little defenseless orphan. After a few months, having recovered from the surgery, Barbara was ready for her new image. Together with Katarzyna, they came up with a fake backstory for the girl Aniczka, who had endured many abuses by the age of 13. To enhance the effect, the women invented a non-existent leukemia diagnosis. All this was done only to pity Clara. Katarzyna and Barbara showed ingenuity. First, they had to forge identity documents, then obtain medical certificates confirming the fatal diagnosis. Third, Aniczka needed to undergo a medical examination to get a certificate for adoption. That's when Katarzyna arranged with the neighbor's daughter to play the role of the orphan. The mysterious doctor who gave the mother strange recommendations regarding her sons and adopted daughter was Barbara herself. Clara was touched by the heart-wrenching story of the orphan and didn't even notice how the 13-year-old Aniczka became something like a spiritual mentor for her, skillfully manipulating the vulnerable woman. Katarzyna didn't tell her sister who Aniczka really was. The woman, on the contrary, did everything to prevent the deception from being revealed. She forged documents and hospital visits. It was Katarzyna who brought the neighbor's girl to the adoption court, who, unlike Aniczka, was a real teenager. Barbara and Katarzyna managed to deceive the legal and medical systems, and since it was officially confirmed that Aniczka was 13 years old, that she was a real person, and that she was an orphan, Clara was allowed to adopt the girl. So why did a 33-year-old woman, pretending to be a 13-year-old girl, infiltrate Clara's family and literally destroy it? It seemed she wasn't seeking financial gain, but simply enjoyed mocking other people. The answer to the question was hidden in Barbara Skrylova's family. Her father, Josef Skryla, was a member of a cult called the Grail Movement, known for its cruelty and mind control methods. Josef headed the Czech branch. This cult broke people to rebuild them as they saw fit. For example, in 2008, one leader of the movement's faction was subsequently arrested for holding his female followers as slaves. The man forced women to do slave labor, treated them badly, subjected them to physical and psychological punishments. The conditions of their detention were so terrible that one of the women died. It was this that led to the cult leader's arrest. Fortunately, the other captives were freed. The cult's main beliefs were that by doing good deeds, followers could go to heaven after death. However, more importantly, performing these good deeds freed them from sins. That is, cult members could boldly break the law, insult others, and do whatever they pleased, knowing that it was all in the name of the higher good of humanity. The followers of this cult had strict beliefs regarding child discipline. They believed that for good upbringing, children needed to be kept in strictness, and that showing cruelty to them made the kids good people. Considering that Barbara's father was the leader of this cult, it's not surprising that she and her brother became followers. Then Katarzyna joined them. The women wanted Klara to become part of them too. They brainwashed her so much that she herself gave her offspring to be torn apart. The camera in the basement was hung so that other cult members could see Jakub and Andrzej's sufferings, as well as to control them when no one was home. The men and women from the Grail movement sect who watched the brothers' torments were not prosecuted. Later, the investigation found out that the cult members uploaded the mockeries of Jakub and Andrzej to the darknet, earning tens of thousands of dollars on the videos. Having learned all this information, the police arrested Jan Turek, Hanna Bashova, and Jan Skrlova, the people who lived in the cottage in the forest. But Barbara, the main suspect, was still at large. The Grail movement cult helped her leave the country with fake documents of another child. It turned out that Barbara not only changed her name, but also became a boy named Adam. She was hiding in Norway. The woman shaved her head bald and for several months posed as a quiet teenager, allegedly arrived in Oslo from California. When teachers and other students began to notice some oddities in the silent young man, he disappeared. Barbara simply escaped from the shelter. The Norwegian police were looking for the boy Adam and only later learned that it was actually the 33-year-old Barbara Skrlova. The woman was caught in January 2008 and deported to the Czech Republic so that she could stand trial for what she did. The trial caused widespread public resonance in the country. All the defendants were found guilty, but the sentences varied. Klara and Katarzyna Mauerova received the harshest sentences, 9 and 10 years, Jan Turek got 5 years, Jan Skrlova and Hanna Bashova 7 years each. At the moment, all 6 criminals have been released. They calmly walk the streets and live their lives. Barbara Skrlova, who became the main figure in this case, whose story turned into a modern urban legend, received a shockingly small sentence, only 5 years. At the trial, the woman appeared holding a teddy bear and clutching a children's book, apparently hoping to the last that she would be acquitted as a minor or as a person with mental disorders. However, the examination didn't reveal any mental health problems in Barbara that could justify her actions. The woman to the last proved in court that the problem was Jakub and Andrzej, that they abused her, so they deserved such treatment. There was no answer to the question of why Barbara Skrlova pretended to be a teenage girl and infiltrated other people's families by deception. One can only guess what drove this woman. After her release, Barbara changed her identity once again and disappeared in an unknown direction. Local newspapers wrote that Skrlova settled in a remote village, away from people. But many are sure that she has infiltrated someone's family again by deception and is posing as another person. 2 years after this story, in 2009, the American psychological horror film titled Orphan was released. The main heroine, Esther, was inspired by the story of Barbara Skrlova, a cruel manipulator suffering from a rare disease. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.